My wife was barely in the ground when my daughter-in-law walked up to me in the pouring rain and told me to pack my bags for a cheap nursing home. I did not say a single word. I just got into my neighbor's truck and let him drive me away. But he did not take me home. He drove me to a deserted warehouse on the edge of Atlanta, handed me a key, and said, "This is something only you can know, and you must never tell your son." I stood there in shock as I opened the heavy metal door and realized that everything I thought I knew was a complete lie. For the last 2 years, my sweet, gentle wife had been hiding a massive and dangerous secret. Before I tell you what was inside that room, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe a mother will do absolutely anything to protect her family. The cold Atlanta rain felt like tiny frozen needles against my dark skin, but I barely noticed it. I was 73 years old and standing over the fresh earth that now covered Ivonne. 45 years of marriage. 45 years of building a quiet life, raising our boy Terrence and sharing every morning coffee. Now it was just me standing alone in a clearing storm. The cemetery was quickly emptying out. Relatives and friends were opening their umbrellas and rushing back to their warm cars, leaving the old widower to his grief. That is when I heard the sharp, impatient clicking of expensive heels striking the wet pavement behind me. It was Savannah. She is the woman my son Terrence married 5 years ago. I did not even need to turn around to know the expression on her face. Even at my wife's funeral, Savannah looked like she was late for a corporate networking event. She wore a tailored black designer dress that cost more than my first car, and her blonde hair was shielded by a massive custom umbrella. She did not offer a comforting hand. She did not express any sorrow for the woman who had welcomed her into our family. She stopped beside me and let out a loud, irritated sigh. "You need to start packing your belongings tonight, Warren," she said, her voice sharp and completely void of any human warmth. "Terrence and I have already found a budget-assisted living facility for you on the other side of the county. I have the paperwork ready. The moving truck arrives on Monday, so do not make this difficult." I kept my eyes fixed on the wet grass covering Yvonne's grave. I did not react. Savannah stepped closer, invading my space. "Did you hear me, old man?" she snapped, leaning in so I could smell her overwhelming, expensive perfume. "You are not staying in that house. It is way too big for a senile retired mailman who cannot even remember where he left his slippers. Terrence and I are taking over the property. We have plans for it, so pack up your old junk and get ready to leave." She thought I was just a broken-down old African-American man suffering from cognitive decline. She thought I was nothing but a fragile retired postal worker who spent his days feeding pigeons. That was the persona I had carefully maintained for the last 2 decades. I played the part perfectly because it kept my family safe, and it kept people from asking questions. Savannah had absolutely no idea who she was talking to. She did not know that before I put on a postal uniform to take care of my sick child in the 90s, I was a senior forensic auditor for the Internal Revenue Service. I spent my prime years hunting down corporate embezzlers, dismantling money laundering rings, and destroying arrogant criminals who thought they were smarter than the system. I knew how to read people, and looking at Savannah, I saw nothing but pure, unadulterated greed. I did not yell at her. I did not defend myself. I just let the cold rain wash over my face, maintaining my absolute silence. My refusal to argue infuriated her. She opened her mouth to scream another insult, but before she could speak, a heavy, calloused hand clamped down firmly on my shoulder. It was Victor. Victor is my next-door neighbor, an old white Marine veteran who has lived beside me for 30 years. He is a man of very few words, but he possesses a fierce loyalty that you do not find easily these days. The man just buried his wife, Savannah. Victor growled, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "Back off before I forget my manners and throw that fancy umbrella into the mud." Savannah scoffed, her face twisting into a mask of pure aristocratic disgust. "You people are all the same," she muttered, turning on her heel. "Be ready by Monday, Warren, or I will have the state remove you by force." She marched away toward Terrence's shiny luxury car. Victor did not let me watch her leave. He gently gripped my arm and guided me toward his rusted old pickup truck parked on the edge of the cemetery grass. He opened the passenger door and helped me inside, shielding me from the heavy rain. I expected Victor to drive us back to our quiet suburban street so I could sit in my empty house and mourn my wife. But when he started the engine, he did not turn toward the suburbs. He merged onto the highway and headed straight toward the industrial district on the far outskirts of Atlanta. We drove in complete silence for 40 minutes. The rhythmic wiping of the windshield wipers was the only sound between us. "Where are we going, Victor?" I finally asked, my voice hoarse from crying earlier that morning. Victor kept his eyes on the wet road, his jaw clenched tight. He did not answer me immediately. He drove deep into a maze of abandoned factories and forgotten warehouses where the city seemed to completely disappear. He pulled the old truck up to a dilapidated brick building with faded paint and a heavy steel roll-up door. He killed the engine and the truck rattled into silence. Victor reached deep into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single heavy brass key. He held it in his hand for a moment, looking down at it before handing it over to me. "Ivonne came to my house a month ago," Victor said, his voice incredibly heavy with emotion. "It was right after the doctors told her the cancer had spread to her brain. She was weak and she could barely walk, but her eyes were burning with a terrifying kind of fire. She handed me this key, Warren. She made me swear on my life and my honor that if she did not make it through the winter, I would bring you to this exact location immediately after they put her in the ground." I took the cold brass key, staring at my old friend in complete confusion. "Why did she not just tell me?" I asked. "Because she knew you would try to stop her," Victor replied, turning to look me directly in the eyes. "She said this is something only you can know. She was very specific, Warren. You must never tell your son Terrence about this place. Not until you understand exactly what you are dealing with. She said Terrence is completely blind to the snake sleeping in his bed." My heart began to pound heavily against my ribs. The old dormant instincts of the forensic investigator suddenly woke up screaming inside my head. I opened the truck door and stepped out into the freezing rain. I walked toward the heavy steel door of the abandoned warehouse. My hands were shaking not from the cold but from the overwhelming anticipation of what my dying wife had hidden from me. I slid the brass key into the rusted padlock. It clicked open smoothly. I pushed the heavy metal door upward, the rusty tracks groaning loudly in the empty industrial lot. I stepped inside the dark space and fumbled for a light switch on the concrete wall. I flipped the switch and a row of bright fluorescent lights buzzed to life, illuminating the entire room. I completely stopped breathing. The metal key slipped out of my hand and clattered loudly onto the concrete floor. It was not a storage unit for old furniture or forgotten memories. It was a fully operational war room. The entire back wall of the warehouse was covered in massive corkboards. The boards were completely plastered with hundreds of documents. I saw printed emails, highlighted bank statements, legal contracts, and dozens of surveillance photographs. Everything was meticulously connected by thin red string charting out a massive and complex financial conspiracy. And right in the absolute center of the wall, pinned under a bright spotlight, was a massive photograph of my daughter-in-law, Savannah. I walked slowly toward the wall, my professional eyes automatically scanning the documents. I saw wire transfer receipts, routing numbers, hidden shell companies, and forged signatures. My sweet, gentle Ivonne, who spent her evenings baking pies and watching game shows, had not been quietly waiting to die. For the last 2 years, while the cancer slowly consumed her body, she had been systematically building a federal-level fraud case against her own daughter-in-law. She had been investigating Savannah in complete, absolute silence, gathering the ammunition I would need to wage a war I did not even know had started. I walked slowly toward the massive corkboard, my eyes scanning the hundreds of financial documents pinned against the cork. My wife Ivonne was a high school teacher. She spent her retirement baking peach cobbler and knitting blankets for our church. But the wall in front of me looked like the inside of a federal investigation bureau. She had mapped out a massive complex web of wire transfers, offshore shell corporations, and hidden bank accounts. Resting on a small metal desk right below the center of the corkboard was a silver digital voice recorder. A small piece of white tape was stuck to it with my name, written in Yvonne's neat cursive handwriting. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. I pressed the play button. The small speaker crackled to life, and the sound of my beautiful wife's voice filled the cold, empty warehouse. Her voice was weak, fragile, and struggling for breath because the cancer was actively destroying her lungs. But her tone was absolutely chilling. It was sharp, cold, and filled with a terrifying clarity. "Warren. My sweet husband," she said, her voice echoing in the dark room. "If you are listening to this, it means I am gone, and you are standing in my war room. I am so sorry I kept this a secret from you for 2 years. I knew if I told you what I was doing, you would try to stop me, or you would take over the investigation yourself. I needed you to focus on loving me during my final days. I did not want our last moments together poisoned by the pure evil sleeping under our son's roof. I closed my eyes, letting her voice wash over me. Savannah is a monster, Warren. Ivonne continued, her voice growing harder. She is stabbing our boy in the back and bleeding him dry. You know Terrence has spent the last 5 years developing that revolutionary medical patent. He thinks Savannah has been helping him secure venture capital funding, but she is not helping him. She is systematically forging his signature and legally transferring the ownership of his life work into a dummy corporation. That corporation is secretly owned by her lover. She has been having an affair for over 2 years, Warren. They are planning to steal the patent and completely cut Terrence out of his own company. My heart slammed against my ribs. Terrence had poured his entire soul into that medical device. It was his dream, and this woman was plotting to rip it out of his hands and hand it over to another man. But that is not all, Ivonne said, coughing weakly into the microphone. Savannah knows we own our house outright. She knows the property value has tripled. She is planning to have you declared legally incompetent. She wants to throw you into a miserable state-run mental asylum to steal the house and liquidate our life savings. She thinks because you are old and quiet that you are completely defenseless. She thinks you are just a foolish, retired mailman. Ivonne paused and took a deep, rattling breath. Show her how wrong she is. Warren, my wife, whispered fiercely, her voice carrying a deadly command. Savannah thinks she is playing a game with a helpless old victim. Remind her who you really are. Dig up the monster you buried decades ago. Use what you do best, and absolutely destroy her. The recording ended with a soft click. The warehouse fell back into a heavy, suffocating silence. I stood there holding the small silver device, feeling a massive, dangerous shift deep inside my soul. Ivonne was right. Savannah and Terrence and everyone else in our neighborhood knew me as Warren, the friendly, retired postal worker. They saw an old man who walked with a slight limp, who spent his weekends planting tomatoes and listening to classic jazz on the porch. That was the identity I had worn for 25 years. But before I put on that blue postal uniform, I was something else entirely. In the 1990s, I was known in the halls of the federal government as the Bloodhound. I was a senior forensic auditor for the Internal Revenue Service. I possessed top-tier security clearance and an absolute lethal talent for tracking dirty money. I did not carry a gun. My weapon was a calculator and a keen eye for financial deception. I spent my prime years hunting down arrogant corporate embezzlers, dismantling sophisticated international money laundering rings, and sending untouchable white-collar criminals to federal prison. I saw through shell companies and offshore accounts like they were made of thin glass. I walked away from that massive power when Terrence was 7 years old. He got severely sick with a rare bone disease. He needed constant care, endless hospital visits, and a father who was actually present. The federal government demanded 80 hours a week and constant travel. I could not be the Bloodhound and be a good father at the same time. So I handed in my badge. I traded my tailored suits for a simple mailbag because the post office offered predictable hours and excellent health insurance. I buried my lethal skills deep underground and built a quiet, simple life to save my son. I never looked back. I never regretted it. But Ivonne knew the truth. She knew the Bloodhound was not dead. He was just sleeping. And Savannah had just kicked the cage. I packed the voice recorder and several key financial documents into my coat pocket. I locked the warehouse and walked back out into the freezing rain where Victor was waiting patiently in his old pickup truck. We drove back to my suburban neighborhood in silence. My mind was no longer clouded by the heavy grief of the funeral. It was operating with cold, ruthless precision. The forensic auditor was fully awake, analyzing data, calculating variables, and preparing for an absolute slaughter. Victor dropped me off at the curb. I thanked him silently and walked up the wet driveway to my home. The house felt incredibly empty without Ivonne, but as soon as I unlocked the front door and stepped into the hallway, I realized I was not alone. A loud, violent crashing sound echoed from the back of the house. It was a heavy metallic bang followed by the sound of splintering wood. I quietly took off my wet coat and walked softly down the hardwood hallway toward the noise. The sound was coming from my private home office. It was a small room where I kept our tax records, family photo albums, and Yvonne's old knitting supplies. I always kept the door locked, simply out of habit. I turned the corner and stopped dead in my tracks. Savannah was standing in front of my office door. She was still wearing the expensive black designer dress from the funeral, but she had kicked off her high heels. In her hand, she held a heavy steel claw hammer from my own toolbox. I watched in absolute silence as she raised the hammer high above her head and brought it smashing down onto the brass doorknob of my private sanctuary. Wood chips flew into the air as the doorframe cracked under the brutal force. She was actively breaking into my private room on the exact same day we put my wife into the ground. She did not even have the basic human decency to wait 24 hours before tearing our home apart. I cleared my throat. It was a soft sound, but in the quiet hallway it cracked like a whip. Savannah gasped and spun around, dropping the heavy steel hammer. It hit the hardwood floor with a loud thud. For a brief fraction of a second, I saw a flash of genuine panic cross her face. She had been caught red-handed destroying my property. Any normal person would have stammered, offered a fake apology, or tried to invent a desperate excuse. But Savannah was not a normal person. She was a deeply arrogant predator who firmly believed she held absolute power over me. The panic in her eyes vanished instantly. It was quickly replaced by a look of profound, elitist disgust. She crossed her arms over her chest and looked at me as if I were a piece of garbage dirtying her pristine floor. "What are you doing, Savannah?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm, giving away absolutely none of the lethal fury boiling in my veins. She did not flinch. She lifted her chin, her blonde hair falling perfectly over her shoulders, and she sneered at me with pure venom. "I am looking for the property deed," she said, her voice echoing loudly in the narrow hallway. "Do not try to fight this old black man. You are completely powerless here. The psychiatrist is coming tomorrow morning to evaluate your deteriorating mind, and I promise you his medical report will ensure you never step foot in this house again." My wife was barely in the ground when my daughter-in-law walked up to me in the pouring rain and told me to pack my bags for a cheap nursing home. I did not say a single word. I just got into my neighbor's truck and let him drive me away. But he did not take me home. He drove me to a deserted warehouse on the edge of Atlanta, handed me a key, and said, "This is something only you can know, and you must never tell your son." I stood there in shock as I opened the heavy metal door and realized that everything I thought I knew was a complete lie. For the last 2 years, my sweet, gentle wife had been hiding a massive and dangerous secret. Before I tell you what was inside that room, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe a mother will do absolutely anything to protect her family. I stared at the heavy steel claw hammer resting on the hardwood floor and then looked up into the cold, calculating eyes of my daughter-in-law. Savannah had just smashed the lock on my private home office. The old forensic auditor inside me, the bloodhound, wanted to step forward, grab her by the throat with legal threats, and expose her entire criminal existence right then and there. But a good investigator knows that you never show your hand to a predator when they think they have you cornered. You let them believe they are winning, so they get extremely sloppy. So I did what I have done for the last 25 years. I put the disguise back on. I let my shoulders slump forward, instantly losing 2 inches of height. I let my hands begin to tremble violently. I widened my eyes, mimicking the terrifying confusion of a fragile mind slipping into the dark abyss of dementia. "I am sorry, Savannah," I stammered, my voice cracking pathetically. "I do not know where I am. I was looking for Ivonne. Is Ivonne making dinner right now? I cannot find her." Savannah let out a cruel, barking laugh. The sliver of panic that had briefly crossed her face upon being caught was completely gone, replaced by pure, arrogant triumph. She truly believed the stress of the funeral had finally pushed my fragile brain over the absolute edge. "Ivonne is dead, you crazy old fool," Savannah spat, kicking the broken wood chips across the hallway. "She is in the ground, and you are going to a locked ward. Go sit in the living room before you hurt yourself." I shuffled away, dragging my feet heavily against the floor, playing the part of a broken man to absolute perfection. I sat on the floral sofa, staring blankly at the wall, waiting. I knew what was coming next. Savannah needed a sudden catalyst to accelerate her timeline, and she was about to manufacture one. 10 minutes later, the front door opened. It was my son, Terrence. He looked completely exhausted. His tie loosened, his eyes red and swollen from crying at his mother's grave. He barely had time to take off his wet coat before Savannah launched her spectacular performance. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The moment she heard Terrence's heavy footsteps in the foyer, she let out a piercing, terrified scream. She threw herself onto the floor near the kitchen island, grabbing her chest and sobbing hysterically. Terrence rushed into the room, pure panic written all over his face. "Savannah, baby, what happened?" he yelled, dropping to his knees beside her. She buried her face in his shoulder, weeping with fake, uncontrollable terror. "It is your father, Terrence," she sobbed, pointing a trembling finger at me, sitting quietly on the sofa. "He completely lost his mind. He came at me. He was screaming that I killed Ivonne, and he grabbed a kitchen knife. He chased me down the hall. I had to lock myself in the office, but he started smashing the door with a hammer to get to me. I watched her lie with absolute, flawless precision. She had taken her own crime, breaking into my private office, and expertly twisted it into a narrative that made her the helpless, terrified victim." Terrence looked at the broken doorframe down the hall, and then looked at me. The immense grief of losing his mother, combined with the shocking stress of his wife's fake assault, completely blinded him to reality. He did not ask for my side of the story. He did not look for the knife she claimed I held. He just saw his crying wife and his silent, seemingly confused father. "Dad, what the hell is wrong with you?" Terrence shouted, marching toward me with his fists clenched. "She is trying to help us. She has been taking care of everything while we bury Mom. Are you completely out of your mind?" I looked up at my son, my only child, the boy I had given up my federal career to save. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to stand up and slap the absolute blindness out of him. But the bloodhound knew that Terrence was already deeply poisoned. If I told him the truth right now, he would never believe me. Savannah had completely isolated his mind. "I did not mean to, Terrence," I mumbled, letting a fake tear roll down my wrinkled cheek. "I was just confused. I thought there was a stranger in the house. I am so sorry. I am just so incredibly tired." "See?" Terrence Savannah cried, crawling over to him and clutching his leg. "He is a massive danger to himself and to me. He cannot stay here tonight. He needs to be locked away before he actually kills someone." Terrence ran his hands over his face, breathing heavily. He was a man breaking under immense pressure. Savannah knew exactly when to strike. She reached into her expensive designer bag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. "I had my lawyer draft these up this morning just in case things got worse," Savannah said, her voice suddenly shifting from terrified victim to practical savior. "It is a full medical and financial power of attorney. If he signs this, we can legally move him into the secure facility tomorrow morning. We can take over his bank accounts to pay for his care, and we can manage the house. It is for his own good, Terrence. You know it is." Terrence looked at the heavy papers and then looked at me. His eyes were filled with a profound, tragic pity. It was the look of a son saying goodbye to a father he thought was already completely gone. "Dad," Terrence said, his voice dropping to a heavy whisper, "you have to sign this. I cannot have you attacking my wife. You are sick. Mom is gone and I cannot take care of you. Sign the papers and let us get you the help you need." He placed the thick stack of documents on the coffee table right in front of me. Savannah stood behind him, wiping her fake tears, a cold, victorious smirk playing proudly on her lips. They were stripping away my human rights, my freedom and my property right there in my own living room. I reached out with a violently shaking hand. "I need my pen," I whispered, patting the pockets of my cardigan. "I can only sign with my lucky pen." Savannah rolled her eyes, but she did not object. "Just let the old fool use his pen." "Terrence," she muttered, "just get it done." I reached deep into the inner pocket of my shirt and pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen. It looked like an elegant antique, but it was actually a highly specialized tool from my days at the Internal Revenue Service. I slowly uncapped it and leaned over the documents. I let my hand tremble violently as I pressed the nib to the paper. I did not sign my actual legal signature. I used a specific chaotic scribble, a forged signature I had developed decades ago when dealing with undercover informants. I signed the bottom of every single page, authorizing the transfer of my life, my house, and my finances over to the woman who was secretly destroying my son. "Thank you, Dad," Terrence said softly, taking the papers away. "It is going to be okay." Savannah snatched the documents from his hands, her eyes gleaming with pure, unfiltered greed. "I will fax these to the facility and the bank right now," she said, turning her back on us and marching up the stairs. "The moving truck will be here early tomorrow." Terrence walked into the kitchen to pour himself a drink, completely exhausted. I stayed on the sofa, staring blankly ahead, playing the defeated old man until the sun finally went down and the house fell into a deep, heavy silence. At midnight, when I was absolutely certain Terrence and Savannah were asleep, I dropped the pathetic act. I stood up from my bed, my posture perfectly straight. I walked to my closet and pushed aside the old shoeboxes. I pulled back a loose floorboard and lifted out a heavy steel briefcase locked with a biometric thumbprint scanner. I pressed my thumb against the glass. The case clicked open. Inside, nestled in black foam, were the tools of a master forensic auditor: encrypted laptops, untraceable burner phones, and specialized surveillance equipment. I pulled out a small black cellular phone and dialed a secure satellite number. It rang once before a sharp, familiar voice answered. "I was wondering when you would finally call Bloodhound," the voice said. It was Marcus, an old colleague from the agency who now ran an elite private security firm in downtown Atlanta. "I heard about Ivonne." "I am so sorry, old friend." "Thank you, Marcus," I said, my voice cold, sharp, and commanding. "But right now I need you to run a full trace on a man named Preston. He runs a tech investment fund in the city. He is the parasite sleeping with my daughter-in-law and trying to steal my son's medical patent. I need every bank record, every offshore wire, and every dirty secret he has ever tried to bury." "Consider it done," Marcus replied instantly. "Are you in trouble, Warren? I heard your son is trying to put you in a home." I let out a low, dark chuckle that echoed in the quiet bedroom. "They think they have me, Marcus. My daughter-in-law forced me to sign a full power of attorney this afternoon. She thinks she owns my house and my bank accounts. She thinks she finally won." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "But she did not win, did she?" Marcus asked, knowing my methods perfectly. "Not even close," I replied, staring down at the heavy silver fountain pen resting on my nightstand. The pen I used was filled with a highly specialized volatile thermal ink we used back in the 90s. In exactly 24 hours, every single signature on those legal documents is going to completely evaporate into thin air, leaving the pages absolutely blank. Furthermore, the signature I used was mathematically proven to be a forgery. Legally, she holds absolutely nothing but empty paper. I looked out the window at the dark Atlanta sky, feeling the lethal energy of the bloodhound coursing through my veins for the first time in 25 years. "Savannah thinks she is playing a game with a senile old fool," I told Marcus. "But the game has only just begun. I am not just going to stop her. I am going to buy her entire world and burn it to the ground. Get me those files by morning." The hunt was officially on. The morning sun had barely crested the Atlanta skyline when I sat back down in my late wife's hidden warehouse. The air was thick with dust and the smell of aged paper, but my mind was operating with terrifying clarity. I spread out the banking records Ivonne had meticulously gathered over the past 2 years. She had highlighted a recurring sequence of offshore wire transfers. The money Savannah was secretly siphoning from my son's accounts was not just disappearing into a black hole. It was flowing directly into a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. It only took me an hour of cross-referencing digital tax footprints, a skill I perfected decades ago at the agency, to unmask the true owner of that shell company. His name was Preston Sinclair. He was the chief executive officer of Vanguard Tech Ventures. He was a notorious figure in the wealthy elite enclaves of the city. He ran a predatory tech investment fund known for gutting startup companies and casually discarding the founders. He also had a quiet but well-documented reputation for refusing to do honest business with African-American entrepreneurs unless he could outright steal their intellectual property. My son Terrence had pitched his revolutionary medical device to Preston's firm 6 months ago. Terrence came home that night completely crushed, believing his prototype had been rejected for lacking market potential. He did not know that his own wife had orchestrated the meeting specifically to hand his blueprints over to her wealthy racist lover. I needed hard evidence. I needed to know exactly when and how they planned to officially launch the stolen patent. In the world of forensic auditing, paper trails tell you where the money went, but audio recordings tell you where the money is going next. I drove my rusted pickup truck to a thrift store on the south side and purchased a faded blue janitorial uniform. I bought a heavy gray trash barrel on wheels and some cheap cleaning supplies. People often wonder what it feels like to be an elderly black man in America. I can tell you it feels like being completely invisible. And when you are a predator hunting your prey, invisibility is your absolute greatest superpower. At 6 in the evening, I walked right through the polished glass doors of the Vanguard Tech Ventures building. The young security guard at the front desk barely glanced up from his smartphone. He saw an old black man pushing a trash cart, and his biased mind immediately dismissed me as part of the background scenery. I kept my head down, shuffling my feet slightly, playing the part of a tired old worker perfectly. I took the service elevator up to the executive floor. The hallways were lined with expensive modern art and plush imported carpets. I made my way to the corner office belonging to the chief executive. The door was locked, but a simple bump key mechanism I kept in my pocket bypassed the heavy deadbolt in 3 seconds flat. The office was a monument to corporate arrogance. There was a massive mahogany desk, heavy leather chairs, and a panoramic view of the city my people helped build. I did not waste time looking through his physical drawers. I reached into the lining of my blue uniform and pulled out a microtransmitter. It was a military-grade listening device my old contact Marcus had couriered to me earlier that morning. It was no bigger than a coat button and powered by a kinetic battery. I slid my hand under the heavy mahogany desk, feeling for a small hollow space near the central wiring port. I firmly pressed the transmitter into the dark crevice where it would never be found by the cleaning staff or routine security sweeps. I emptied his trash can into my barrel, wiped down the glass table to leave no trace of my presence, and walked out of the building exactly the same way I came in, completely unseen. 2 hours later, I was sitting in the dark cabin of my parked truck blocks away from my own house, holding a pair of heavy headphones over my ears. The transmission was crystal clear. I listened as Preston Sinclair entered his office, pouring himself a glass of expensive bourbon. A few minutes later, another man entered the room. It was Preston's head of legal acquisitions. I sat in the dark, gripping the steering wheel as the lawyer confirmed that the final patents for the medical device had been successfully rebranded and transferred into their offshore holdings. Terrence's name had been completely erased from his own life work. The brilliant device my son spent 5 years building in our garage was now the legal property of a man who despised him. Then I heard the detail that would set my entire trap in motion. Preston instructed his lawyer to prepare the press release for this coming Friday. They were hosting the annual Atlanta Innovation Gala, an exclusive high society event filled with the wealthiest investors in the state. Preston planned to stand on stage and publicly unveil the stolen medical patent as his own crowning achievement, solidifying his company as a pioneer in the medical tech field. He was going to steal my son's future in front of hundreds of cheering elites, while my son sat at home grieving his mother and comforting the very wife who betrayed him. My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. Friday. I only had 4 days to completely dismantle his empire and save my son. I was about to pull off my headphones and start the engine when I heard Preston's desk phone ring. He answered it on speaker. The voice that echoed through my headphones made my blood run absolutely freezing cold. It was Savannah. She sounded completely relaxed, probably pouring herself a glass of wine in the very kitchen my late wife had designed. She did not sound like a grieving daughter-in-law. She sounded like a predator who had just finished her meal. "Preston, darling," she purred, her voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. "It is done. I have the old man's signature on the power of attorney." He was shaking and crying like a pathetic child. It was almost too easy to break his mind. "Tomorrow morning I will throw him into the cheapest hospice facility I can find and drain his bank accounts dry. Terrence suspects absolutely nothing. I will see you at the gala on Friday, and we can finally celebrate our new life." I sat in the dark truck staring out at the quiet suburban street. She thought she had won. She thought the old man was defeated and broken. She thought she could erase my existence, steal my son's legacy, and walk away into a life of luxury with her wealthy lover. She had no idea that every single word she spoke was being recorded by the former senior forensic auditor of the federal government. Savannah and Preston thought they were playing a simple game of chess against a blind opponent. But the bloodhound was already tracking their scent, and by Friday night they would realize they had walked right into a slaughterhouse. The heavy oak front door of my house swung open without a single knock. It was exactly 9 in the morning. I was sitting in my faded armchair wrapped in a thick wool cardigan, staring blankly at the cold fireplace. Savannah marched into the living room, her expensive high heels clicking aggressively against the polished hardwood floor. She did not come alone. Right behind her was a short, balding white man wearing a cheap, wrinkled suit and carrying a thick leather clipboard. He had the greasy, restless eyes of a bottom-feeding scam artist. Savannah had not brought a medical professional to check on my failing health. She had brought a fake lawyer to appraise my property and inventory my entire life. She did not even bother to say good morning. She walked straight past me, treating me like a piece of invisible broken furniture. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the beautiful antique mahogany display cabinet standing in the corner of the room. That cabinet held my late wife Yvonne's most precious belongings. It held the delicate porcelain tea set she had carefully collected over 40 years and the silver-framed photographs of our family history. "Write all this junk down." Savannah ordered the greasy man, her voice dripping with absolute elitist disgust. "Do not bother getting individual appraisals for the dishes or the old silver. It is all ghetto trash anyway. Just lump it together as an estate sale lot. We need this entire house completely emptied and sanitized by the end of the week so we can put it on the market." The balding man nodded eagerly, scribbling quickly on his clipboard. He walked over to Yvonne's beautiful cabinet and began tapping the glass with his pen, calculating how quickly he could liquidate my memories for a quick payout. I sat perfectly still, my hands trembling slightly in my lap, playing the role of the heavily medicated senior citizen to absolute perfection. Savannah looked down at me, a cold, victorious smirk playing on her lips. She thought she had completely conquered me. She thought the forged signature I gave her yesterday afternoon meant she possessed total supreme control over my existence. She honestly believed she was standing in a house that belonged entirely to her. What she did not know was that while she was sleeping in her luxurious bed, I had spent the entire night transforming my quiet suburban home into a high-tech federal surveillance trap. Hidden inside the smoke detector, the bookshelf, and the very porcelain teapot she was currently insulting were 6 military-grade micro-cameras. They were actively recording every single word, every arrogant gesture, and every piece of criminal evidence she was generously providing. She was openly conspiring to steal my assets on crystal-clear, high-definition video. I slowly pushed myself up from the armchair, letting my knees buckle slightly. I kept my head down, adopting a look of deep, pathetic submission. "I am going to the kitchen," I mumbled, my voice weak and raspy. "Would you and your guest like a cup of hot tea, Savannah?" Savannah let out a harsh, mocking laugh. She looked at the fake lawyer and rolled her eyes. "Look at him," she sneered loudly, completely ignoring the fact that I was standing right there. Yesterday he was waving a knife like a dangerous lunatic, and today he is trying to play the perfect little host. The dementia is completely rotting his brain. She turned back to me, her eyes hard and devoid of any human empathy. "Make the tea, old man," she commanded. "And make it quick. I have a very busy schedule today and you have a lot of packing to do. Your medical transport arrives tomorrow morning to take you to the secure facility." I shuffled slowly toward the kitchen, dragging my feet across the floor. Once I was safely behind the kitchen counter, out of her direct line of sight, my fragile, trembling demeanor completely vanished. My posture straightened and the cold, calculating energy of the bloodhound returned. I prepared the tea with precise, deliberate movements. I was not making tea to be hospitable. I was setting the stage for a psychological strike. Physical violence is loud and messy, but psychological warfare, when executed perfectly, leaves an enemy completely paralyzed from the inside out. I placed 2 delicate porcelain teacups on a silver serving tray and carried them slowly back into the living room. Savannah was standing by the large bay window, staring out at the front lawn, already planning the expensive landscaping she would do once I was securely locked away in a mental ward. The fake lawyer was busy tapping on the walls, checking the structural integrity of the home they were planning to steal. I approached Savannah, holding the silver tray with violently shaking hands. The porcelain cups rattled loudly against the metal. I stopped right next to her, allowing her to look down on me from her position of absolute arrogant power. She reached out and took a cup from the tray, taking a slow sip without ever saying thank you. She was completely relaxed, utterly confident in her total victory. I looked up at her, my eyes wide and cloudy, performing the role of the confused, helpless victim. Then, without changing my fragile posture or raising my weak, raspy voice, I dropped the absolute bomb. "Are you absolutely sure Preston is going to give you the 50% equity he promised you?" I asked, my tone completely casual, as if I were asking about the weather. The effect was absolutely instantaneous and spectacularly violent. Savannah froze. The delicate porcelain teacup stopped halfway to her mouth. Her breathing completely ceased. I watched the blood rapidly drain from her perfectly made-up face, leaving her skin a horrifying shade of pale gray. Her eyes widened to an unnatural size, staring at me in pure, unadulterated terror. The name Preston hit her like a physical bullet to the chest. Preston was her secret wealthy lover. Preston was the corrupt tech investor she was conspiring with to steal my son's medical patent. Preston was the man she had spoken to on her private phone, completely unaware that I had bugged his office. There was absolutely zero logical reason for an isolated, senile old man in the suburbs to know that specific name or the exact details of their highly illegal corporate equity agreement. Her mind completely short-circuited, trying to process the impossibility of my question. The teacup in her hand began to rattle uncontrollably, splashing hot tea over the rim and onto her expensive designer dress. She did not even notice the burning liquid. What she stammered, her voice, a high-pitched, breathless squeak. "What did you just say? Who told you that name?" She stepped closer to me, her arrogant composure entirely shattered. She was desperate, panicking, searching my cloudy eyes for any sign that the broken old man had suddenly transformed into a terrifying threat. The fake lawyer turned around, sensing the sudden massive spike in tension in the room. I looked at her panicked face and I flawlessly executed the pivot. I let my eyes wander aimlessly toward the ceiling. My jaw went slack and I let a confused, foolish smile spread across my wrinkled face. I tilted my head to the side, looking completely lost in a deep mental fog. "Preston," I mumbled, scratching the side of my head with a trembling hand. "Who is Preston?" "I think the neighbor's new dog is named Preston." "Yes, that is it. It is a very loud dog, Savannah. It barks all night long. It makes my head hurt terribly." I shuffled away from her, carrying the silver tray back toward the kitchen, muttering incoherent nonsense about stray dogs and loud noises. I left her standing perfectly still by the bay window, completely paralyzed by a massive wave of psychological terror. I had successfully planted the seed of absolute paranoia deep inside her treacherous mind. She could no longer trust her own reality. Did the senile old man just have a random, lucky moment of clarity? Did he overhear a private phone call while wandering the house? Or was someone else watching her? The doubt would eat away at her confidence like a highly corrosive acid. She would start questioning her secure phone lines. She would start doubting Preston's loyalty, wondering if he had leaked their secret agreement. Savannah was no longer a confident predator hunting a helpless victim. She was now a terrified, paranoid criminal constantly looking over her shoulder. The psychological torture had officially begun, and I was going to let her slowly tear her own mind apart before I delivered the final, lethal blow. As soon as Savannah and her greasy fake lawyer walked out the front door, I locked the heavy deadbolt and walked straight down the hallway to my hidden server room. The frail, shuffling old man vanished the second the door clicked shut behind me. I rolled up the sleeves of my thick wool cardigan and sat down in front of my glowing monitors. It was time to follow the money. Back in my days as a senior forensic auditor for the Internal Revenue Service, they taught us one fundamental truth. Criminals can lie with their mouths, they can forge legal documents, and they can manipulate human emotions, but the numbers never lie. Money always leaves a permanent digital footprint. And nobody in the entire federal government was better at tracking those footprints than the Bloodhound. Savannah thought she was a brilliant criminal mastermind, but in reality she was just a sloppy, arrogant amateur. She had connected her sleek silver laptop to my home wireless network, assuming I did not even know how to turn on a computer or manage a router. She thought I was just a senile, retired mailman. It took me exactly 7 minutes to bypass her basic security firewalls and gain complete administrative access to her hard drive. I sat in the dark room, my eyes scanning the endless rows of digital files, hidden folders, and financial spreadsheets she thought she had securely buried. I was operating with a cold, ruthless efficiency. I opened her private banking applications and started pulling the digital threads of her massive deception. What I found hidden in those encrypted folders made my blood run absolutely freezing cold. Savannah was not just planning to steal my son's revolutionary medical patent to hand over to her wealthy, racist lover, Preston. She was actively burying Terrence alive in a massive mountain of crippling debt to fund Preston's failing tech investments. I pulled up a series of high-interest predatory loan applications. Savannah had stolen Terrence's social security number, forged his digital signature, and taken out $200,000 in highly toxic business loans. She had deliberately leveraged his entire medical startup, securing the massive debt against the very laboratory equipment he used to build his prototypes. I leaned closer to the monitor and followed the wire transfers. Every single penny of that $200,000 was quickly funneled through a series of fake vendor invoices and deposited directly into the primary operating account of Vanguard Tech Ventures, Preston's company. She was using my son's stolen credit to keep her lover's arrogant empire afloat. It was a level of financial cruelty that disgusted even a hardened veteran investigator like me. She was bleeding my boy dry and setting him up to take the entire fall when the massive loans eventually defaulted and the bank came to collect. My deep concentration was suddenly shattered by the bright ringing of my cellular phone resting on the metal desk. It was a video call. The name flashing on the screen was Terrence. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold, analytical energy of the federal auditor fade into the background. I softened my eyes, slumped my shoulders slightly, bringing the fragile old man back to life, and answered the call. Dad Terrence said, his voice cracking through the small speaker. The image on the screen broke my heart into a million tiny pieces. My brilliant, hard-working son looked completely devastated. He was sitting in his small commercial laboratory surrounded by half-finished medical devices and stacks of unpaid bills. He had dark, heavy circles under his exhausted eyes, and his shoulders were slumped in absolute total defeat. He looked like a man who had been completely beaten down by the world. "Hey there, my boy," I said, keeping my voice gentle and slightly raspy, playing the part of the supportive but ignorant old father. "You look incredibly tired, Terrence. Are you working too hard in the lab again?" Terrence let out a dry, hollow laugh and rubbed his face with his hands. "It is all falling apart, Dad," he whispered, his voice heavy with profound despair. "I do not understand what is happening to me. The company accounts are completely draining. The equipment suppliers are calling me every single morning about missed payments, and I cannot figure out where the capital is going. I review the books and the numbers just do not make any logical sense. I feel like I am losing my mind." He paused, taking a shaky breath, trying to hold back his tears. "Savannah is trying to help me manage the accounting, but she says the medical tech market is just too tough right now. She says maybe I should just sell the patent to a larger firm for pennies and completely cut my losses before I go bankrupt. She says I am not cut out to be a chief executive." Every word he spoke was a rusted blade twisting deep in my gut. He was sitting there blaming himself, questioning his own sanity and feeling like a complete failure, while the woman sleeping in his bed was actively destroying his life. I wanted to scream the truth through the phone. I wanted to tell him that his wife was a vicious parasite, and that his hard-earned money was sitting in the bank account of a corrupt, racist tech investor. But the bloodhound knew that revealing the truth prematurely would ruin the entire operation. Terrence was too emotionally fragile right now. If I told him everything, he would immediately confront Savannah. She would panic, destroy the evidence, claim I was crazy, and disappear with the stolen cash, leaving Terrence with the massive debt and a broken heart. I needed to build an ironclad cage before I let them know they were trapped. I looked at my son's defeated face through the digital screen. "You are a brilliant man, Terrence," I told him, my voice thick with genuine emotion. "Do not let this temporary darkness convince you to give up your dream. You have worked entirely too hard for this. Your mother believed in you, and I believe in you. Just hold on a little bit longer. Give it until the end of the week. Promise me you will not sign away your company today." Terrence sighed heavily, looking at the floor before looking back up at me. "Okay, Dad," he murmured softly. "I will hold on until Friday. But I do not know how much more of this failure I can take. I love you, Dad." "I love you too, my son," I replied. I ended the video call and placed the phone gently on the metal desk. The sadness in my chest instantly vanished, entirely replaced by a lethal burning fury. Savannah and Preston thought they could treat my son like a disposable bank account. They thought they could steal his brilliant mind, drain his resources, and leave him bankrupt and broken while they celebrated their stolen success. They had made a fatal miscalculation. I was no longer just going to stop them from stealing my house. I was going to systematically dismantle Preston's entire corporate structure. I was going to buy his massive debt, seize his precious company, and freeze every single asset he thought he owned. And on Friday night at their arrogant tech gala, I was going to hand the keys to his entire empire directly over to my son. The hunt was escalating, and they had absolutely no idea the hounds were already at their door. The towering glass and steel structure of the First Atlanta Fidelity Bank loomed over the busy downtown streets like a massive monument to corporate greed and untouchable wealth. It was the premier investment bank in the city, handling the private fortunes of the elite, including the corrupt tech funds managed by Preston Sinclair. I parked my old rusted sedan a few blocks away and walked slowly toward the grand entrance. I was dressed precisely for the part I needed to play. I wore a faded brown wool cardigan that had seen better days, a pair of worn corduroy trousers, and scuffed orthopedic walking shoes. I looked exactly like a fragile 73-year-old black man who had wandered far away from his quiet suburban porch. I pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped into a lobby that smelled of expensive imported coffee and rich mahogany. The air conditioning was freezing, contrasting sharply with the warm, humid Atlanta air outside. The lobby was filled with men in custom-tailored suits and women carrying designer briefcases. As I shuffled my feet across the pristine marble floor, the bustling noise of the room noticeably dropped. Wealthy clients and sharp young executives glanced at me with expressions ranging from mild confusion to outright elitist disgust. They saw a tired old man from the South Side and instantly decided I was a nuisance, a mistake, a piece of trash that had blown in through the front door. I walked directly to the massive marble reception desk. The young woman sitting behind the monitor wore a sharp blazer and a condescending smile. Before I could even open my mouth, she held up a perfectly manicured hand and spoke to me in the slow, exaggerated tone people use when they think they are talking to a confused child. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice dripping with fake professional sympathy. "I think you are in the wrong building. The retail branch where you can cash your Social Security check is 3 blocks down the street. This building is exclusively for corporate and high-net-worth investment clients." I did not raise my voice. I kept my shoulders slumped and my hands resting gently on the marble counter. "I am in the exact right building, miss," I replied, my voice a soft, raspy whisper. "I need to speak with the managing director of corporate acquisitions. I believe his name is Richard Croft." The receptionist let out a short, patronizing laugh. She shook her head and looked around for a security guard. "Sir, Mr. Croft only takes meetings with elite corporate partners. He does not handle personal banking. Please turn around and leave before I have to call someone to escort you outside." I reached into the pocket of my faded cardigan and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. I slid it across the smooth marble. "Type that 9-digit routing number into your secure terminal, miss," I instructed gently. "And when your system flashes a red priority override, you are going to pick up your telephone and tell Mr. Croft that he has exactly 3 minutes to clear his entire schedule for me." She rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, annoyed sigh, but she tapped the numbers into her keyboard just to humor the crazy old man. I watched her face closely. In less than 2 seconds, the arrogant smile vanished entirely from her lips. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her perfectly applied makeup looking like a pale mask. She stared at the computer screen, her mouth slightly open in pure shock. She did not say another word to me. She immediately picked up her phone, her hands trembling violently as she dialed the top floor. 5 minutes later, I was standing inside the sprawling penthouse office of Richard Croft. The room was breathtaking, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the entire city. Croft was a man in his late 50s wearing a $3,000 Italian suit and a heavy gold watch. He was standing behind his massive oak desk, looking intensely irritated by my presence. He had been forced to cancel a golf game with a state senator, and he was clearly furious that the priority override belonged to a shabby old black man in a moth-eaten sweater. "Look, I do not know what kind of glitch you triggered in our system," Old Man Croft barked, leaning his knuckles aggressively against the desk. "But I am an incredibly busy man managing billions of dollars in corporate assets. State your business and get out of my office before I have you arrested for trespassing." I stood in the center of the plush carpet. For the first time all day, I dropped the pathetic disguise. I straightened my spine, instantly growing taller. I rolled my shoulders back, releasing the tension of the fragile persona. The weak trembling in my hands ceased entirely. When I looked into his eyes, the quiet, defeated old mailman was completely gone. The bloodhound was awake and staring right through him. "I am not here to waste your time, Richard," I said, my voice dropping into a deep, cold, and commanding baritone that echoed off the high ceiling. "I am here to buy a man, and I am here to save you from spending the rest of your miserable life in a federal penitentiary." Croft frowned, his irritation suddenly faltering against the sheer, unyielding weight of my newly revealed presence. He opened his mouth to shout for his security team, but I was already moving. I reached deep into the inner pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a solid black polycarbonate credentials case. I flipped it open and tossed it heavily onto his pristine oak desk. The heavy brass shield gleamed in the sunlight. It bore the terrifying official seal of the United States Department of the Treasury. Next to the shield was my identification card stamped with a bright red clearance code. Internal Revenue Service, Level 8, Senior Forensic Consultant. Croft looked down at the badge and his arrogant world completely shattered. A Level 8 clearance is not a standard tax auditor. It is the absolute highest civilian authority in the federal financial sector. It is a ghost clearance given only to the elite investigators who hunt down global money laundering syndicates. A Level 8 agent has the supreme legal authority to freeze an entire banking institution with a single phone call without needing a judge's signature. Croft's breathing hitched loudly in his throat. He stumbled backward, landing heavily in his expensive leather chair. He looked at the badge and then up at me, his eyes wide with absolute paralyzing terror. He finally realized that the old black man he had just insulted held the power to destroy his entire legacy in the blink of an eye. Sir Croft stammered, his arrogant corporate vocabulary completely evaporating. I had absolutely no idea. What is the Treasury Department investigating here? We have always complied with federal regulations. We run a clean bank. You run a blind bank, Richard. I corrected him, sharply pulling a thick stack of documents from my coat and slamming it down next to my badge. Preston Sinclair and his firm Vanguard Tech Ventures have been funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen fraudulent funds directly through your commercial accounts for the last 2 years. He is using your pristine reputation to wash dirty money stolen from the elderly and stolen from vulnerable medical startups. If I make one phone call right now, the federal government will freeze every single asset in this building, and your face will be on the front page of every newspaper tomorrow morning as a co-conspirator in a massive embezzlement ring. Croft was sweating profusely now. Thick beads of moisture gathered on his forehead and rolled down his pale cheeks. He raised his shaking hands defensively. "Please, sir," he begged, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please do not call Washington. I swear to you, I knew nothing about Preston's illegal activities. We will cooperate fully. Tell me exactly what you need me to do to make this go away." I leaned forward, planting my calloused hands firmly on his desk, getting right into his terrified face. "I am going to give you a way out, Richard," I said, my voice a lethal whisper. "You are going to log into your main terminal right now and place a permanent silent federal hold on every single account belonging to Preston Sinclair. He will not be able to withdraw a single penny, and you will not alert him to this hold under any circumstances." "Done," Croft gasped frantically, tapping his computer keyboard. "It is done. The accounts are frozen." "What else?" I looked at the terrified banker. "Preston heavily leveraged his own company to secure massive business loans from your bank," I explained. "He currently owes you $5 million. He is planning to use a stolen medical patent this Friday to secure new funding to pay you back. I am not going to let that happen." I reached into my pocket one last time and pulled out a certified banking draft. It represented the culmination of 45 years of quiet, disciplined saving by me and my late wife Ivonne. We never bought luxury cars or fancy vacations. We invested, we saved, and we compounded our hidden wealth. It was our secret fortress. I dropped the draft onto the desk. $8 million, I stated coldly. "I am buying the entirety of Preston Sinclair's corporate debt right now. I am purchasing his loans directly from your bank at a premium. You get to wipe a toxic liability off your books and save yourself from a federal money laundering indictment. In exchange, I become the sole primary creditor of Vanguard Tech Ventures. I want the immediate legal authority to seize all of his assets, his company, and his patents the very second he defaults." Croft stared at the incredible sum of money printed on the paper. He looked up at me completely, utterly defeated. He realized I was not just conducting a federal investigation. I was executing a perfectly calculated financial assassination, and I was using his bank as the murder weapon. Croft grabbed his expensive pen with trembling fingers and hastily signed the massive debt transfer agreements, making the transaction completely binding and official. He pushed the heavy legal documents back across the desk toward me. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket and desperately wiped the thick sweat from his forehead. He slowly stood up from his leather chair, completely abandoning his corporate pride. He bent at the waist, executing a deep, subservient bow to the man in the faded brown sweater. "It is completely done," Croft whispered, his voice shaking with a mixture of profound relief and absolute awe. "Understood, Mr. Warren. Preston currently works for you without even knowing it." Thursday morning arrived with a heavy gray sky that perfectly matched the suffocating atmosphere inside my house. I sat at the kitchen table nursing a cold cup of coffee, playing the role of the quiet, oblivious old man. Across the room, Savannah was buzzing with frantic, arrogant energy. She was dressed in a sleek designer pantsuit, packing a small, expensive overnight bag with rapid, excited movements. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime for my completely exhausted son. Terrence was sitting on the edge of the sofa, rubbing his bloodshot eyes. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. His medical startup was completely bleeding cash, and he still had no idea that the woman standing right in front of him was the one holding the knife. "I am so sorry I have to leave you today, baby," Savannah cooed, walking over and planting a fake affectionate kiss on Terrence's forehead. "This business trip to Chicago was completely unavoidable. The marketing firm needs me to pitch to the new clients. But I promise I will be back by Saturday morning to help you deal with your father." Terrence nodded blindly, completely trusting the monster he had married. "Just go and knock their socks off, Savannah," he murmured, his voice thick with profound fatigue. "I will hold down the fort here. Have a safe flight." She was not going to Chicago. She was not going to pitch to new clients. Savannah was checking into a luxury suite at the Midtown Plaza Hotel, preparing for the massive tech gala she and her racist lover Preston were hosting that very evening. Tonight was the night they planned to stand on a brightly lit stage and publicly unveil my son's stolen medical patent to a room full of wealthy investors. She was kissing my son goodbye while actively planning his absolute professional and emotional destruction. Terrence grabbed his briefcase and walked out the front door, heading to his laboratory for another day of miserable failure. The heavy door clicked shut behind him. The very second Terrence's car pulled out of the driveway, the sweet, loving wife completely vanished. Savannah turned around and glared at me, her blue eyes practically vibrating with cruel, predatory excitement. "Stand up, Warren," she commanded, her voice cracking like a leather whip. "It is time for you to go to your room." I let my hands tremble as I slowly pushed myself up from the kitchen table. I shuffled my feet, keeping my head bowed low, acting like a fragile, terrified animal. Savannah marched behind me, her sharp heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor, herding me down the hallway like a prisoner of war. She pushed me roughly into my bedroom. I stumbled forward, pretending to lose my balance, and caught myself on the edge of my unmade bed. Savannah stood in the doorway, looking at me with absolute profound disgust. "Enjoy your last night in this house, old man," she sneered, a wicked, victorious smile spreading across her face. "Tomorrow morning, a specialized medical transport is coming to collect you. I told the doctors you are prone to violent psychotic outbursts, so they are bringing physical restraints. I am locking this door right now. You are going to sit in here without food or water for the next 24 hours. By the time those doctors arrive tomorrow, you will be so weak, dehydrated, and delirious that they will legally certify your dementia without a second thought." She did not wait for me to respond. She grabbed the brass door handle and slammed the heavy wooden door completely shut. A second later, I heard the sharp metallic clank of a heavy commercial deadbolt locking from the outside. She had secretly installed it earlier that week specifically for this exact moment. She wanted to break my physical body to ensure my mental evaluation was a total catastrophic failure. I stood in the quiet bedroom listening as her footsteps echoed down the hallway. I heard the front door open and close, followed by the roar of her luxury SUV speeding away from the house. I was completely alone. The frail, trembling old man immediately evaporated into thin air. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back to release the tension of the pathetic disguise I had worn all week. A cold, dark smile crept onto my face. Savannah thought a commercial-grade deadbolt could hold me prisoner in my own home. She thought she had successfully neutralized a retired mailman. I walked over to my wooden dresser and opened the top drawer. I pushed aside a stack of old wool socks and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside the pouch was a professional tension wrench and a finely crafted steel pick. During my 2 decades as a senior forensic auditor for the Internal Revenue Service, I did not just sit at a desk reviewing tax returns. I frequently raided offshore shell companies, illegal gambling dens, and the heavily fortified safe houses of violent corporate embezzlers. I knew how to breach physical security just as easily as I breached digital firewalls. I walked up to the locked bedroom door and slid the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyhole, applying a very light pressure. I slipped the steel pick inside and gently felt for the mechanical pins. 1, 2, 3, 4. I manipulated the internal tumblers with absolute fluid precision. It took exactly 12 seconds. With a soft, satisfying click, the heavy deadbolt rotated and snapped open. I turned the brass handle and the door swung wide open. I was free. But I was not going to run away. I was going to get ready for a party. I walked over to my deep walk-in closet and reached all the way to the very back. Hidden behind my old postal uniforms and my gardening clothes was a heavy, dust-proof garment bag that had not been opened in over 20 years. I unzipped the thick plastic cover, carefully exposing the dark fabric inside. It was a custom-tailored charcoal pinstripe suit. I had this suit handcrafted in London during an international money laundering investigation back in 1998. It was made from the finest lightweight wool cut with sharp, aggressive lines designed to project absolute, uncompromising authority. It was the armor of the bloodhound. I stripped off my faded cardigan and my worn corduroy trousers. I put on a crisp white dress shirt, fastening the pearl buttons with steady, confident hands. I stepped into the charcoal trousers and slipped the heavy, tailored jacket over my shoulders. It still fit me perfectly. I stood in front of the full-length mirror and tied a dark crimson silk tie, adjusting the knot tight against my collar. I looked at my reflection. The 73-year-old black man staring back at me did not look like a helpless victim waiting for a psychiatric ambulance. He looked like a highly lethal federal executioner. The suit brought back a surge of cold, calculating energy that made my blood run hot. Savannah and Preston thought they were hosting a victory gala for the wealthy elite of Atlanta. They were about to find out that the supreme predator had just entered their pristine hunting ground. I turned away from the mirror and walked over to the hidden biometric safe under my floorboards. The green light flashed as it scanned my thumbprint, and the heavy steel door popped open. I reached inside and pulled out the ammunition I had meticulously gathered over the past 4 days. First, I took out the thick stack of highlighted banking records. These documents proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Preston Sinclair's company was completely bankrupt, and that I was now the sole legal owner of his massive corporate debt. Second, I pulled out the glossy high-definition photographs my private investigator had captured. Beautiful, crystal-clear images of Savannah and Preston holding hands, entering hotel rooms, and laughing together while my son was working himself into an early grave. And finally, I pulled out the crown jewel of my entire operation. It was a single sheet of heavy stationery bearing the official seal of the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation. Marcus, my old colleague at the agency, had pulled a massive favor with the Cyber Crimes Division. When he handed over my evidence of Preston's money laundering and Savannah's corporate identity theft, a federal judge did not hesitate. The paper in my hand was a fully authorized active federal arrest warrant for both Preston Sinclair and Savannah Vance. I walked over to my desk and picked up a large, dark brown manila envelope. The kind of plain, unremarkable envelope a retired mailman might carry on a routine delivery. I opened the metal clasp at the top. I folded the banking records and slid them inside. I took the glossy photographs of the illicit affair and dropped them in right behind the financial ruin. Finally, I folded the federal arrest warrant, making sure the bright red signature of the federal judge was the very first thing they would see, and slipped it into the absolute center of the package. I sealed the envelope tight, holding it in my hands. It was not thick, and it did not weigh very much, but it was a fully loaded weapon possessing enough destructive power to obliterate their entire arrogant existence. I checked my gold wristwatch. It was 6 o'clock in the evening. The Atlanta Innovation Gala was just beginning to fill with the wealthiest corporate elites in the city. Savannah and Preston were probably standing by the open bar drinking vintage champagne, smiling and accepting early congratulations for the brilliant medical patent they had violently stolen from my family. I tucked the dark brown envelope under my arm and walked out of the bedroom, leaving the broken lock behind me. I walked through the quiet house, stepping out into the cool evening air, and climbed into my rusted old sedan. It was time to go to a party. It was time to teach the elite exactly what happens when you mistake a sleeping lion for a week-old dog. The Atlanta Innovation Gala was held at the most exclusive luxury hotel in the heart of the downtown financial district. It was a massive, sprawling venue reserved only for the highest echelons of corporate power. Valets in crisp white shirts rushed to open the heavy doors of imported sports cars and stretched limousines guiding the wealthy guests toward the red carpet. I did not drive my rusted suburban sedan to the front door. I took a standard city cab, stepping out onto the wet pavement just a few yards away from the velvet ropes. The crisp evening air felt electric against my skin. I adjusted the lapels of my charcoal pinstripe suit, the armor I had not worn in over 2 decades, and walked right past the line of waiting billionaires with the supreme confidence of a man who owned the very ground they stood on. I pushed open the heavy brass double doors and stepped into the grand ballroom. The sheer opulence of the room was designed to intimidate. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a brilliant golden light over the sea of wealthy guests. Waiters glided silently across the polished marble floors, carrying silver trays of vintage champagne and delicate appetizers. But the most prominent feature in the room was a giant digital banner projecting across the back wall. It read, "Vanguard Tech Ventures, the future of medical innovation." Directly beneath that banner, resting on a lighted pedestal, was a sleek glass display case holding the prototype of the revolutionary medical device my son Terrence had spent 5 agonizing years building in our garage. They were actively celebrating the theft of my son's life work. They were preparing to publicly claim his absolute genius as their own. The room was packed tightly with the elite class of Atlanta. Venture capitalists, powerful politicians, and arrogant corporate titans mingled and laughed. It was a sea of wealthy white privilege. They were sipping expensive champagne and exchanging fake pleasantries, completely unaware that they were currently celebrating a massive federal crime. And then I stepped fully into the light. Even in my immaculate, custom-tailored suit, I stood out like a blaring warning siren. I was a 73-year-old African-American man stepping uninvited into a highly guarded sanctuary built on generational wealth and systemic exclusion. The gentle hum of the classical string quartet continued to play from the corner, but the arrogant conversations nearest to the grand entrance suddenly died down. Eyes turned toward me. I felt their heavy, judgmental stares scanning my face, my skin, and my completely unapologetic presence. They did not see a retired federal investigator capable of destroying their financial portfolios. They saw a glaring anomaly. They saw an old black man who must have surely wandered past the security desk by mistake. The subtle whispers of prejudice rippled through the crowd. I did not shrink under their heavy gazes. I did not lower my head. I walked forward with the slow, deliberate, and utterly terrifying stride of an apex predator returning to his natural hunting ground. I scanned the massive room, searching for my targets. Right in the absolute center, standing on a slightly elevated platform, were the 2 people I had come to utterly destroy. Preston Sinclair. The corrupt chief executive was wearing a sharp velvet tuxedo, holding a crystal glass of expensive bourbon and laughing loudly at a joke made by a city senator. Standing right beside him, holding his arm with zero shame, was my treacherous daughter-in-law, Savannah. She was wearing a stunning backless silver evening gown dripping in heavy diamonds that were undeniably purchased with the money she had violently stolen from my son. They were holding court, receiving early congratulations for the brilliant medical project they were about to publicly unveil. Savannah turned her head to grab another glass of champagne from a passing waiter. As she turned, her eyes swept casually across the ballroom floor. Her gaze locked directly onto mine. I stopped walking and simply stood there 20 feet away, holding the heavy, dark brown manila envelope firmly in my right hand. The bright, triumphant smile on her perfectly made-up face instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. Her eyes widened in absolute shock and pure, unadulterated panic. Her brain simply could not comprehend what she was looking at. In her twisted and cruel reality, I was supposed to be securely locked inside my dark bedroom, starving, severely dehydrated, and descending into total mental madness, waiting for a psychiatric ambulance to carry me away at dawn. Yet here I was, standing tall, powerful, and impeccably dressed, infiltrating her perfect night of stolen glory. The panic quickly morphed into a furious, violent rage. She whispered something urgently to Preston, dropped his arm, and marched aggressively through the wealthy crowd toward me. Her silver dress flowed behind her like a toxic storm cloud. She stopped just inches from my face, completely ignoring the curious, disgusted stares of the wealthy investors standing nearby. She kept her voice to a harsh, venomous whisper, desperately trying to avoid making a public scene, but her body was literally shaking with fury. "What in the hell are you doing here?" she hissed, her blue eyes flashing with pure, unfiltered hatred. How did you get out of that locked room? Who let this savage old man inside this building? You are supposed to be locked away, you crazy senile fool. You are ruining everything." I did not answer her. I just looked down at her with a calm, empty expression, letting her toxic anger boil over. My total silence infuriated her even more. She looked around frantically, her chest heaving, ready to signal for the hotel security team. "You are completely out of your mind," Savannah spat, leaning closer so I could smell the sweet vintage champagne on her breath. "You are a pathetic, broken old man, and you are ruining the most important night of my entire life. I am going to have you dragged out of here in handcuffs and thrown directly into a locked mental ward tonight. I am calling security right now." Before she could raise her manicured hand to signal the guards, Preston Sinclair sauntered over. He moved with the slow, arrogant swagger of a man who truly believed he owned the entire universe and everyone living inside it. He looked me up and down, taking in my vintage pinstripe suit and my remarkably calm demeanor. He let out a loud, patronizing scoff. His face was a mask of supreme racial and financial superiority. "Is this the pathetic father-in-law you were telling me about, Savannah, Preston?" asked, his voice dripping with absolute contempt and mocking amusement. "The retired mailman who is completely losing his fragile little mind." Savannah nodded, her hands clenched into tight fists. "Yes, he somehow broke out of the house. He is completely unhinged and dangerous, Preston. We need to get him out of here right now before he starts screaming and ruins the entire presentation for the investors." Preston took a slow, confident sip of his bourbon and smiled a cold, cruel smile. He patted Savannah gently on the bare back, an arrogant gesture of control. "Relax, my dear," Preston murmured confidently, completely underestimating the lethal threat standing right in front of him. "I know exactly how to handle people like him. Do not cause a scene in front of the board members." He turned his arrogant gaze back to me, gesturing dismissively toward a set of heavy wooden double doors tucked away in a dark, quiet corner of the ballroom. "Let us step into the private service hallway," old man Preston commanded, treating me like a disobedient stray dog that needed to be put down. "We are going to take a nice quiet walk to the back door. I will handle this savage old man myself, and you are going to leave my property before I have you physically crushed into the pavement." I looked at Preston Sinclair, taking in his expensive velvet tuxedo and his unearned absolute arrogance. Then I looked down at the heavy brown envelope resting in my hand containing his complete and utter devastation. I let a slow, dark smile spread across my face. I gave him a small, polite nod. "Lead the way," I replied, my voice low, smooth, and dangerously calm. I followed them away from the bright lights and the classical music, stepping into the quiet shadows of the service corridor, completely ready to burn their entire arrogant world to ashes. The heavy wooden double doors swung shut behind us, completely cutting off the elegant classical music and the loud, obnoxious laughter of the wealthy elite. The service corridor was stark and cold, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. It was a massive visual contrast to the golden opulence of the grand ballroom we had just left. This was the hidden underbelly of the luxury hotel, a place meant for the invisible workers, the maintenance staff, and the discarded trash. It was the absolute perfect setting for the execution I was about to perform. Preston Sinclair leaned casually against the cold concrete wall, sliding his hands deep into the pockets of his expensive velvet tuxedo. He looked at me with a mixture of profound boredom and intense racial disgust. He clearly thought he was just humoring a crazy old man, giving his mistress a quiet, private moment to discipline her pathetic father-in-law out of sight from the wealthy investors. He had absolutely no idea that he was standing inside his own tomb. Savannah did not waste a single second. The moment the heavy doors sealed us off from the public, her carefully constructed mask of the elegant, supportive partner completely evaporated. Her beautiful face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She marched toward me, her expensive silver high heels echoing sharply on the bare concrete floor. She stopped right in front of me, her chest heaving with toxic fury, invading my personal space like a rabid animal. "You stupid, arrogant old fool!" she hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. "How dare you humiliate me tonight? How did you get out of that house?" I stood perfectly still, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I looked at her with the cold, calculating eyes of the bloodhound. I did not offer her an explanation. I did not cower or tremble like the fragile, retired mailman she thought I was. My absolute silence and my complete lack of fear pushed her over the absolute edge of her sanity. She was entirely used to me looking at the floor and shuffling my feet in submission. She raised her right hand. The heavy diamond bracelet on her wrist caught the harsh fluorescent light as her arm swung violently through the air. The slap was vicious and loud. Her open palm struck my left cheek with a sharp, cracking sound that echoed heavily down the long, empty corridor. The physical sting was sharp and hot, blooming rapidly across my weathered skin. A heavy gold ring on her finger caught the edge of my lower lip, drawing a tiny bead of warm metallic blood. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to protect myself. I slowly turned my head back to look at her, maintaining absolute, unbroken eye contact. Decades ago, I had stared down violent cartel accountants, armed money launderers, and desperate men facing life in prison. A physical slap from a spoiled, greedy narcissist felt like a gentle summer breeze. Preston let out a low, cruel chuckle from the dark corner of the hallway. "Put him in his proper place, Savannah," he murmured, taking a slow sip of his expensive bourbon. "Show the old dog exactly who owns him." Savannah was breathing heavily, staring at me with wild, furious eyes. She was deeply unnerved by my complete lack of physical reaction, but her towering, unearned arrogance quickly buried her temporary fear. She truly believed my stoicism was just the paralyzing shock of a broken, senile mind. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "You are going to give me the original property deeds right now," she commanded, her voice a shrill, demanding screech. "I know you brought them, Warren. I know you came here to beg because you finally realize I hold all the absolute power over your pathetic existence. Give me the original power of attorney documents and the deed to your slum of a house. Hand them over and crawl back to your pathetic little rat hole before I have Preston break your legs and throw you in the river." She held out her hand, palm up, completely expecting me to surrender my entire life to her. She desperately wanted the absolute legal control she thought she had earned by manipulating my exhausted son. She wanted the final piece of the puzzle that would allow her to throw me into a miserable, locked medical facility and liquidate my family home for pure profit. I looked at her open, greedy hand. Then I looked at the dark brown manila envelope resting quietly in my own grip. It was time. The long, meticulous hunt was finally coming to an end. The trap had been flawlessly set. The prey was standing directly over the trigger, and it was time to let the heavy steel jaws snap completely shut. I reached into the inner pocket of my custom-tailored charcoal pinstripe suit. I pulled out a crisp white cotton handkerchief and slowly wiped the small drop of blood from the corner of my mouth. I folded the fabric neatly and placed it back into my pocket. My movements were slow, deliberate, and completely devoid of any fear or submission. I lifted the heavy brown envelope and held it out toward her waiting hand. "Here you go, Savannah," I said, my voice dropping into a low, smooth, and terrifyingly calm baritone. "I brought exactly what you asked for. Your entire property, your beautiful future, and everything you have ever worked for is waiting for you right inside this envelope." Savannah let out a loud, arrogant scoff. She snatched the brown envelope from my hand with the desperate, greedy swiftness of a starving vulture stealing a piece of meat. A smug, victorious smile instantly returned to her perfectly made-up face. She looked over her shoulder at Preston, holding the cheap envelope up in the air like a massive golden trophy. "You see, Preston," she gloated, her voice dripping with toxic triumph. "I told you he was just a weak, pathetic old coward. All you have to do is show these people a little bit of force and they fold like cheap paper. He actually brought the deeds. He is finally surrendering to us." Preston smirked, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. "Good girl," he praised her, completely oblivious to the massive storm currently hovering directly over his head. "Now check the signatures and let us get back to the party. The wealthy investors are waiting for the big reveal." Savannah turned her full attention back to the brown envelope. She gripped the metal clasp at the top and aggressively ripped the seal open. The sound of the thick paper tearing echoed loudly in the quiet service hallway. It was a sharp, violent noise, the sound of a curtain rising on a beautiful, devastating tragedy. She slid her long, manicured fingers deep inside the opening. She was entirely expecting to feel the familiar texture of standard real estate contracts or the heavy stock of a certified property deed. She was anticipating the final legal document that would fund her lavish lifestyle and secure her complete escape from my son, Terrence. She pinched the thick stack of folded documents and eagerly pulled them out into the harsh fluorescent light. I watched her face with intense clinical fascination. It happened in absolute slow motion. Her blue eyes eagerly scanned the top of the very first page, expecting to see the logo of a local property lawyer or the stamp of a county clerk. Instead, her arrogant, victorious eyes locked onto the heavy, terrifying official seal of the United States federal government. The smug, superior smile that had been plastered across her face did not just fade away. It instantly froze and shattered as if her entire skull had been submerged in liquid nitrogen. Her breathing completely stopped. The color drained from her skin so incredibly fast she looked like a walking corpse. She stared at the bold, heavy black text printed across the top of the page. It was not a deed to my house. It was not a power of attorney granting her control of my life. It was a massive federal asset seizure order issued directly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and fully authorized by the Department of the Treasury. And right below the terrifying federal header, clearly highlighting the exact reason for her absolute ruin, was her own name printed in bold ink next to the words corporate espionage and massive financial fraud. Her trembling fingers fumbled blindly, feeling the weight of the undeniable reality resting in her hands. She was holding the exact legal instrument of her own total destruction, and the look of pure, unadulterated horror in her eyes was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Savannah stood frozen in the harsh fluorescent light of the service corridor. Her breathing had completely stopped. The heavy federal asset seizure order resting in her perfectly manicured hands was not just a piece of paper. It was a mirror reflecting the absolute end of her luxurious existence. I watched her perfectly constructed, arrogant reality violently fracture into a million irreparable pieces. Her eyes darted wildly across the bold, black ink, trying desperately to find a mistake or a punchline to a sick joke. But the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation does not make jokes about corporate espionage and massive financial fraud. The sheer weight of the truth finally crushed her fragile spine. Her hands began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. The thick stack of legal documents slipped through her numb fingers. They scattered across the cold concrete floor like dead leaves falling from a rotting tree. She stumbled backward, her silver high heels scraping harshly against the floor until her back hit the cold concrete wall. She could not speak. Her throat was completely paralyzed by the suffocating grip of pure, unadulterated terror. She slowly slid down the wall until she was sitting on the dirty concrete. Her expensive silver evening gown completely ruined her hands, clutching her chest as she gasped for air. Preston Sinclair was still leaning casually against the far wall, swirling the expensive amber bourbon in his crystal glass. He had been watching the exchange with a look of mild irritation. In his deeply arrogant and privileged mind, he assumed Savannah was just having a dramatic emotional reaction to a stubborn old man. He thought I had brought a fake deed or an outdated will to try and negotiate a pathetic compromise. He let out a loud, annoyed sigh, rolling his eyes at the sudden mess of papers scattered across his pristine service hallway. "Savannah, what in the world is wrong with you?" Preston muttered, his voice dripping with condescending impatience. "Pick up those papers and stop acting like a hysterical child. We have a room full of venture capitalists waiting for us to unveil the medical device. We do not have time for these ghetto theatrics. Get the deed from the old man and let us go." Savannah did not respond. She just sat on the floor, staring blankly at the scattered papers, her mind completely broken by the sheer magnitude of her own consequences. Preston scowled, deeply offended that his mistress was ignoring a direct command. He pushed himself off the wall and marched over to us. He set his crystal glass down on a nearby service cart and crouched down to gather the scattered documents himself. He snatched the first page off the floor, fully expecting to see a residential property deed. But his arrogant blue eyes locked onto the exact same heavy federal seal that had just completely destroyed his mistress. I stood perfectly still, watching the exact moment the powerful tech billionaire realized he was standing on a landmine that had already detonated. The first document he picked up was the official federal freeze order. It explicitly detailed the immediate suspension of Vanguard Tech Ventures and listed his name as the primary target of an active federal money laundering and wire fraud investigation. But that was not the document that completely broke his mind. That honor belonged to the second page he scooped off the floor. It was the certified debt transfer agreement I had personally executed that very morning with Richard Croft at the First Atlanta Fidelity Bank. Preston stared at the heavily highlighted banking records. They clearly proved that his massive $5 million corporate loan, the very money he used to fund his lavish lifestyle and his fake tech empire, had been completely sold. The bank had dumped his toxic debt to avoid federal prosecution, and the sole legal entity that purchased that $5 million debt was a private, anonymous ghost corporation called the Ivonne Trust. Preston's heart rate spiked so fast I could practically see the pulse pounding in his neck. His perfectly manicured hands began to shake, matching the exact same pathetic tremor that had just overcome Savannah. He frantically flipped through the pages, reading the attached bank statements that proved his company accounts were currently frozen at exactly $0. He read the aggressive legal clause that explicitly granted the Ivonne Trust the immediate unyielding right to seize all of his corporate assets, including the stolen medical patent, the very second his accounts defaulted. He realized with a sickening absolute clarity that he did not own his company anymore. He did not own his luxury cars or his penthouse apartment. Every single thing he falsely claimed to possess was now legally owned by the mysterious trust fund holding his massive unpayable debt. His entire arrogant identity was built on stolen wealth, and that wealth had just been completely evaporated by a man he thought was a senile retired mailman. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. Thick beads of cold sweat broke out across his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. He slowly looked up from the scattered papers on the concrete floor. His arrogant, mocking gaze was entirely gone. It was instantly replaced by the wide, terrified stare of a cornered rat who suddenly realized it was locked inside a cage with a starving lion. He looked at my polished leather shoes and slowly panned up to my custom-tailored charcoal pinstripe suit. He finally looked into my cold, unyielding eyes. His brain was violently misfiring, trying to connect the dots between the fragile old man Savannah had described and the lethal federal executioner standing right in front of him. He could not comprehend how an elderly black man from the south side of Atlanta possessed the financial firepower to buy a $5 million corporate debt in a single afternoon. "You," Preston wheezed, his voice completely breaking into a high-pitched, pathetic whisper. He swallowed hard, a loud, audible gulping sound trying to force air into his tightening lungs. "You bought my debt. The bank sold you my entire company. Who are you?" I did not smile. I did not offer him a single ounce of mercy or comfort. I slowly reached up with my steady, calloused hands and calmly adjusted the knot of my dark crimson silk tie, making sure it sat perfectly straight against my collar. I looked down at the broken, shivering billionaire kneeling on the dirty concrete floor, surrounded by the undeniable evidence of his total, absolute destruction. "I am Warren," I replied, my voice a deep, resonant rumble that echoed off the cold walls. "I am the husband of Ivonne, the brilliant woman who spent her dying days building this entire federal case against you. And currently I am your sole legal creditor, Preston. You have been completely bankrupt since 3 o'clock this afternoon." I stood in the cold service corridor watching the absolute destruction of a human mind. Savannah was sitting on the dirty concrete floor, her expensive silver evening gown pooling around her like dirty water. I watched her perfectly manicured hands claw desperately at the cold floor as if she were trying to stop herself from falling off a massive cliff. The human brain is a remarkable organ designed to protect itself from sudden catastrophic trauma, but there is absolutely no psychological shield thick enough to block the sheer magnitude of the devastation I had just dropped on her. Just 10 minutes ago, she was the undisputed queen of the Atlanta Innovation Gala. She was dripping in stolen diamonds, sipping vintage champagne, and preparing to step onto a brightly lit stage to claim my son's brilliant medical patent as her own. She had forged Terrence's signature, taken out $200,000 in fraudulent loans, and actively planned to lock her 73-year-old father-in-law inside a miserable state-run mental asylum. She thought she had completely secured a lifetime of unearned luxury. She thought she had stolen my house, my son's future, and my absolute freedom. But the heavy federal documents scattered across the floor told a completely different story. In the span of a few agonizing seconds, her entire delusional universe was violently ripped away. She did not just lose the stolen medical company. She lost the stolen money, the luxury lifestyle, and the total control she thought she had over my family. She was no longer a wealthy socialite. She was an exposed federal criminal staring down the barrel of a decade in a maximum security penitentiary. The realization hit her central nervous system like a massive physical blow. Her breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid. Her chest heaved up and down in erratic, panicked bursts as her lungs desperately fought for oxygen that her terrified brain simply could not process. Her eyes darted wildly around the narrow concrete hallway, searching for any possible escape route, any sliver of hope. She was a drowning woman frantically looking for a life raft. And then she looked up at Preston Sinclair. Preston was still kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the undeniable evidence of his own total bankruptcy. He was staring at the banking records that proved I was now the sole legal owner of his entire tech empire. His pristine velvet tuxedo felt like a heavy prison uniform. He was sweating profusely, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Savannah looked at him, her blue eyes wide and pleading. In her deeply twisted and dependent mind, Preston was her ultimate savior. He was the wealthy, powerful billionaire who was supposed to fix everything with his expensive lawyers and his corrupt political connections. She honestly believed their illicit affair actually meant something to him. She thought they were partners in crime. Preston Savannah gasped, her voice a high-pitched, pathetic wheeze. "Preston, please do something. Call your legal team. Call the bank. We can fight this. He is just a retired mailman. He cannot do this to us. You have to fix this, Preston." She reached out her trembling hand, gently grabbing the sleeve of his expensive velvet jacket. It was a desperate plea for protection from the monster she had awakened. But Preston Sinclair was not a loyal partner. He was a ruthless, narcissistic predator who only cared about his own survival. And right now, the woman holding onto his sleeve was the exact reason his entire $5 million empire was currently burning to the ground. He looked at Savannah's trembling hand, and then he looked at her terrified face. The profound fear in his eyes instantly rapidly mutated into a dark, explosive, and violently toxic rage. He violently yanked his arm away from her grasp, as if her touch were a highly contagious disease. He pushed himself up from the floor, his expensive leather shoes scraping harshly against the concrete. He towered over her, his face completely twisted with pure, hateful fury. "Fix this!" Preston screamed, his voice echoing off the concrete walls with terrifying volume, completely abandoning any shred of his refined corporate composure. "Fix this. You completely ruined my life, you stupid, arrogant parasite." Savannah flinched, shrinking back against the cold wall. "Preston, you told me we were a team." She sobbed, tears of pure panic finally spilling over her perfectly applied makeup and running down her pale cheeks. "A team!" Preston roared, his hands clenched into tight, furious fists at his sides. "You told me your father-in-law was a helpless, senile old fool. You told me he was a pathetic, retired postal worker who could not even remember his own name. You promised me this was going to be a clean, easy acquisition. You literally invited a senior federal forensic investigator directly into my private bank accounts. You brought a federal executioner right to my front door." Preston did not stop there. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of losing his company, his wealth, and his freedom completely snapped whatever fragile restraint he had left. He realized that his life was permanently over, and he needed someone to absorb the physical impact of his absolute rage. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Before Savannah could even raise her hands to protect her face, Preston drew his arm back. He did not slap her with the back of his hand like a gentleman offering a warning. He struck her with a vicious open palm, channeling every single ounce of his terrifying anger and complete despair into the physical blow. The sound of the impact was sickeningly loud. It cracked through the quiet service corridor like a gunshot. The sheer brutal force of the slap caught Savannah squarely across the jaw, snapping her head violently to the side. Savannah let out a sharp, agonizing cry. The impact completely lifted her off her precarious balance. She was thrown sideways, her body crashing hard against the unforgiving marble and concrete floor. She landed in a tangled heap of expensive silver fabric and ruined dignity. Her designer diamond earrings clattered against the stone. I stood perfectly still, watching the two arrogant elites completely turn on each other like starving rabid dogs trapped inside a fighting pit. There is absolutely no loyalty among thieves, especially when the stolen gold completely evaporates. Savannah lay on the cold floor, completely disoriented. The physical shock of Preston's violent assault, combined with the massive psychological obliteration of her entire life, was simply too much for her biological system to handle. Her brain was completely short-circuiting. She tried to push herself up using her trembling arms, but her muscles entirely refused to obey her commands. Her elbows buckled and she collapsed back onto the dirty floor. She began to hyperventilate. Her mouth opened wide, gasping desperately for air, but her throat was completely restricted by the crushing weight of her severe panic attack. The expensive vintage champagne she had been drinking all night in the grand ballroom suddenly rushed back up her throat, mixing with the sour, toxic taste of pure, unadulterated terror. She rolled onto her hands and knees, her body convulsing violently. She began to heave her stomach muscles contracting in painful, agonizing spasms as she retched onto the pristine floor of the luxury hotel. She was completely broken, stripped of her fake aristocratic grace, reduced to a pathetic, shivering mess. "Please," she managed to croak out between the violent spasms, her voice completely unrecognizable. "Please, I cannot breathe." I did not offer her a glass of water. Preston did not kneel down to comfort her. We both just stood there, watching her completely drown in the suffocating ocean of her own devastating consequences. Savannah let out one final, desperate, rattling gasp. Her eyes rolled completely back into her head, exposing the terrifying white sclera as her overloaded nervous system finally initiated an emergency shutdown. Her arms gave out completely. Her head slumped forward, hitting the cold floor with a dull, heavy thud. She passed out cold. Her body lay perfectly limp on the dirty concrete floor of the service corridor, completely unresponsive. The arrogant, treacherous daughter-in-law who had actively tried to throw me into a locked mental asylum was now lying unconscious at my feet, utterly destroyed by the quiet, heavy weight of the absolute truth. The psychological trauma had completely shattered her mind, and the trap I had built for her was finally completely sealed shut. The cold concrete floor of the service corridor offered absolutely no comfort to the unconscious woman. 5 agonizing minutes passed before Savannah finally began to stir. I stood completely still, watching her perfectly manicured fingers twitch against the dirty stone. She let out a pathetic groaning sound as her eyes slowly fluttered open. Her vision was blurred, and her designer silver dress was completely ruined, stained with dirt and the remnants of her own severe panic attack. She tried to push herself up onto her knees, her head hanging low, her blonde hair sticking to her sweaty face. She was desperately hoping that the crushing federal asset seizure order and Preston's violent physical assault were just the dark fragments of a horrible nightmare. But the nightmare was completely real, and it was about to get infinitely worse. Before she could even gather the strength to stand up, the heavy wooden double doors leading to the grand ballroom burst wide open with an explosive, violent force. It was not the hotel security staff responding to a noise complaint. A highly coordinated team of armed federal agents and local police officers flooded into the narrow hallway. Their heavy black tactical boots pounded against the polished floor, shaking the very foundation of the luxury hotel. Bright flashlights cut through the dim fluorescent lighting. The loud authoritative shouts of law enforcement echoed off the walls, commanding everyone to freeze and put their hands in the air. Preston Sinclair tried to make a sudden, desperate run for the emergency exit, but his arrogant billionaire status offered absolutely zero protection against federal authorities. 2 massive tactical agents slammed him violently against the concrete wall. The sickening crunch of his expensive velvet tuxedo hitting the hard stone was immediately followed by the sharp, heavy metallic click of cold steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists. Savannah sat on the floor, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the raid. The elegant high society tech gala happening just on the other side of the doors had been completely shut down. The wealthy venture capitalists and arrogant corporate elites were currently being held in the main room, watching the spectacular public downfall of the man who had just promised them the future of medical innovation. Savannah pressed her back against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably as the federal agents secured the perimeter. The radio chatter from the police officers filled the air with a cold, clinical reality. She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated desperation. She was frantically searching her broken mind for a way out, a loophole, a lie she could spin to save her own skin. But her entire network of deception was about to be permanently eradicated from the face of the earth. Through the chaotic sea of dark uniforms and flashing badges, a single civilian figure slowly walked into the service corridor. The armed agents naturally parted to let him through because I had specifically cleared his arrival with the Federal Task Force commander earlier that afternoon. It was my son. It was Terrence. He was no longer wearing the exhausted, defeated expression of a man bleeding out from a failing medical startup. He was wearing a dark suit, his posture completely straight, his jaw clenched tight with a profound, terrifying resolve. I had sent him a simple text message 3 hours ago telling him to come to the downtown luxury hotel and wait in the lobby until the police arrived. He stepped into the harsh light of the hallway and stopped right next to me. He did not look like a grieving son mourning the sudden loss of his mother anymore. He looked exactly like the bloodhound. He looked like a man who had finally seen the absolute unfiltered truth. Terrence stood perfectly still, his dark eyes slowly scanning the absolute wreckage of the service corridor. He looked at Preston Sinclair groaning against the wall with his hands bound in heavy steel chains. He looked at the massive stack of federal banking records and asset seizure orders scattered across the wet concrete floor. And then his eyes fell upon the glossy, high-definition surveillance photographs resting near his expensive leather shoes. I watched my son look down at the crystal-clear images of his beautiful wife wearing designer clothes and intimately kissing the very man who had arrogantly rejected his medical patent 6 months ago. He saw the pictures of them holding hands entering luxury hotel rooms and laughing together while he was sitting alone in a cold laboratory slowly going bankrupt. The final heavy curtain of his complete blindness was violently ripped away. Savannah saw the exact moment his eyes locked onto the affair photographs. A fresh wave of absolute terror washed over her pale face. She realized her ultimate safety net, the husband she had manipulated and abused for 5 years, was currently looking directly at her unforgivable treason. She scrambled frantically to her hands and knees, ignoring the federal agents standing all around her. She crawled across the dirty concrete floor, weeping hysterically, her silver dress dragging behind her like a heavy chain of guilt. She reached Terrence and threw her arms around his legs, clinging to him with the desperate, pathetic grip of a drowning parasite. "Terrence, please," she wailed, her voice cracking and echoing tragically in the narrow hallway. "Honey, you have to listen to me. Your father is completely insane. He is trying to ruin me. He forged those pictures, Terrence. He set this entire thing up because he is a crazy old man and he hates me. Please, baby, tell them to let me go. I love you so much. It is all a lie." The entire hallway fell into a dead heavy silence. The federal agent stopped moving, waiting to see how the young inventor would react to the weeping woman clinging to his legs. Savannah buried her face in his dark trousers, sobbing loudly, pouring every single ounce of her manipulative energy into the performance. She honestly believed that her fake tears and her familiar physical touch would trigger his deep protective instincts. She thought he was still the same exhausted, broken man who had blindly trusted her just that morning. She thought she could still gaslight him into believing the retired mailman was the true villain of the story. But Terrence did not reach down to comfort her. He did not stroke her blonde hair or whisper that everything would be okay. He stood absolutely rigid, a cold, impenetrable fortress of righteous anger. He looked down at the woman who had secretly drained his bank accounts, forged his signatures, and actively plotted to throw his elderly father into a locked mental asylum. He reached his steady hand into the inside pocket of his dark suit jacket. He did not pull out a handkerchief to dry her fake tears. He pulled out a thick, heavy stack of crisp, white legal documents. He held them tightly in his hand, his knuckles turning slightly white from the pressure. He looked at Savannah with an expression of pure, absolute disgust that cut deeper than any physical blow ever could. "Let go of me," Savannah Terrence commanded, his voice completely devoid of any warmth or affection, dropping into a low, dangerous tone that sounded exactly like my own. He forcefully stepped back, breaking her desperate physical grip, leaving her completely unsupported on the cold floor. He threw the heavy legal documents directly at her chest. They hit her and scattered over her ruined dress. "Those are your divorce papers and a permanent judicial restraining order." Terrence stated, his words ringing out with lethal, crystal-clear precision. "You are absolutely entirely erased from my life." Savannah gasped, shaking her head in violent denial, clutching the papers with trembling hands. "No, Terrence, you cannot do this," she pleaded, her voice a pathetic whisper. "You do not understand." "Ivonne, my mother understood everything." Terrence interrupted, his voice rising with a fierce, protective fury. "She understood exactly what kind of monster you were. She sent a delayed, encrypted email to my private server. It arrived exactly 1 hour ago. I heard the voice recordings, Savannah. I saw the offshore wire transfers. I heard you planning to steal my medical patent with that racist criminal standing against the wall. You did not just betray my trust and steal my life work. You actively tried to lock my grieving father inside a miserable mental institution to steal his home. You are absolute, unredeemable scum. My wife was barely in the ground when my daughter-in-law walked up to me in the pouring rain and told me to pack my bags for a cheap nursing home. I did not say a single word. I just got into my neighbor's truck and let him drive me away, but he did not take me home. He drove me to a deserted warehouse on the edge of Atlanta, handed me a key, and said, "This is something only you can know, and you must never tell your son." I stood there in shock as I opened the heavy metal door and realized that everything I thought I knew was a complete lie. For the last 2 years, my sweet, gentle wife had been hiding a massive and dangerous secret. Before I tell you what was inside that room, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe a mother will do absolutely anything to protect her family. The heavy silence in the service corridor was only broken by the pathetic sound of Savannah sobbing onto the dirty concrete floor. Terrence had just delivered the final devastating blow, completely erasing her from our family. She was utterly broken, stripped of her fake aristocratic elegance, and left with absolutely nothing. But the absolute worst of human nature was about to reveal itself right in front of our eyes, when a sinking ship is finally going down. The rats do not hold hands and sing songs of loyalty. They climb over each other violently, clawing at anything they can reach, just to keep their own heads above the freezing water for one more second. Preston Sinclair was the ultimate rat. He was currently pinned against the cold concrete wall by 2 massive federal agents, his wrists tightly bound in heavy steel cuffs. He had watched my son throw the divorce papers onto Savannah's ruined silver dress. He had listened as Terrence laid out the undeniable evidence of their massive corporate theft and their cruel conspiracy to lock me inside a mental asylum. Preston realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that Savannah had absolutely no leverage left. She was completely useless to him now. And more importantly, he realized that the quiet, elderly black man standing in the custom-tailored pinstripe suit was the only person in the entire building who held the keys to his absolute survival. Preston completely ignored Savannah weeping on the floor. He ignored my son Terrence, who had just reclaimed his dignity and his stolen medical patent. Preston locked his panicked, bloodshot eyes directly onto mine. The arrogant billionaire tech investor, the man who refused to do honest business with African-American entrepreneurs, was about to completely abandon his toxic pride and beg a retired mailman for his miserable life. "Mr. Warren." Preston gasped, his voice trembling with a pathetic, desperate urgency. "Please, you have to listen to me. I am a victim here too. I had absolutely no idea she was planning to throw you into a psychiatric ward. I swear to God I did not know she was stealing money from her own husband to fund my company." Savannah suddenly stopped crying. Her head snapped up from the dirty concrete floor, her tear-streaked face frozen in a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. She stared at the man she had risked her entire life for, the wealthy lover who had promised her a lifetime of luxury and protection. She brought the medical patent to me. Preston continued, his voice growing louder and more frantic, desperately trying to convince the federal agents holding him against the wall. She forged all of Terrence's signatures on the transfer documents. She masterminded the entire theft. "I was just a blind investor, Mr. Warren. I thought it was a legitimate business acquisition. She completely manipulated me. If you tell the federal prosecutor to drop the money laundering charges against my firm, I will give you everything. I will testify against her in open court. I will stand on the witness stand and tell the jury exactly how she planned the entire fraud. Just give me my company back, and I will hand her over to you on a silver platter." The sheer, absolute cowardice of his words hung heavily in the cold service corridor. He was offering to completely destroy the woman he had been sleeping with for 2 years just to save his own miserable skin. Something deep inside Savannah's mind completely snapped. The final fragile thread connecting her to sanity was violently severed. She realized that she had destroyed her marriage, betrayed a loving family, and committed massive federal crimes for a man who viewed her as nothing more than a disposable human shield. The cold, calculating socialite completely vanished. In her place emerged a wild, feral, and incredibly dangerous animal. Savannah let out a raw, agonizing scream that did not even sound human. It was a guttural, terrifying shriek of pure, absolute betrayal and blind rage. She scrambled up from the dirty concrete floor, her ruined silver evening gown tearing loudly as her high heels slipped on the wet stone. She did not run toward the exit. She launched her entire body directly at Preston Sinclair. "You lying piece of garbage!" Savannah shrieked, her voice echoing violently down the narrow hallway. "You promised me. You said we were going to build an empire together. You made me do those things to the old man." She crashed into Preston with the force of a desperate, wounded predator. Because Preston's hands were securely cuffed behind his back, he was entirely defenseless. Savannah raised her perfectly manicured hands and began violently clawing at his face. Her sharp fingernails dug deep into his pale skin, leaving long, bleeding scratches across his cheeks and his forehead. She tore at his expensive velvet tuxedo, ripping the crisp white shirt underneath, completely destroying his carefully constructed wealthy facade. Preston screamed in pain and terror, thrashing his head back and forth, desperately trying to avoid her vicious attacks. "Get this crazy lunatic off me!" he wailed, his voice cracking as blood began to trickle down his face. "She is completely insane. Help me!" The violent, chaotic struggle carried them right through the open wooden double doors and completely out of the hidden service corridor. They stumbled directly into the bright, blinding light of the grand ballroom. The classical string quartet had long since stopped playing. Hundreds of the most powerful and wealthy corporate elites in Atlanta were standing in the massive ballroom, completely frozen in absolute shock. These were the venture capitalists, the arrogant politicians, and the high society socialites who just 20 minutes ago were sipping vintage champagne and eagerly waiting to kiss Preston Sinclair's ring. They had admired Savannah's beauty and praised Preston's brilliant business acumen. They thought these two people represented the absolute pinnacle of success and untouchable white privilege. Now that elegant, sophisticated illusion was completely shattered for the entire world to see. The elite crowd gasped and backed away in horror as Preston and Savannah crashed into a table of expensive appetizers, sending delicate crystal glasses and silver trays crashing to the polished marble floor. They were literally tearing each other apart like two starving rats fighting over a piece of rotten garbage. Savannah continued to scream and claw at him, her blonde hair a tangled, messy bird nest, her face contorted with insane fury. Preston was sobbing and bleeding, his expensive velvet suit hanging in ruined shreds, completely stripped of his arrogant billionaire armor. The wealthy guests did not step forward to help them. They did not offer sympathy or support to their fallen golden boy. Instead, a sea of glowing rectangular screens suddenly illuminated the dark edges of the ballroom. Hundreds of smartphones were instantly raised into the air. The very same people who used to flatter and enable Preston Sinclair were now eagerly recording his spectacular, violent downfall. Camera flashes erupted rapidly, capturing every single humiliating second of their pathetic brawl. Their absolute ruin was being permanently documented and broadcasted to the entire world. Enough, the lead federal task force commander barked, his deep voice cutting through the chaotic screaming. 4 massive tactical agents rushed forward, pulling the two feral animals violently apart. They dragged Savannah off of Preston, slamming her face down onto the cold, polished marble floor of the grand ballroom. She thrashed and kicked, screaming incoherent curses at her former lover, completely abandoning any remaining shred of human dignity. I stood in the doorway of the service corridor with my son Terrence, watching the beautiful, devastating symphony of their destruction reach its absolute crescendo. The federal agent grabbed Savannah's wrists and forcefully pulled them behind her back. The sound echoed perfectly across the massive, silent ballroom. It was the sharp, heavy metallic click of cold steel snapping completely shut. The handcuffs locked tightly around her wrists, permanently binding her to the devastating consequences of her own greedy actions. "Get them both out of my sight," the federal commander ordered loudly. The armed agents hauled Savannah and Preston roughly to their feet. They did not take them out through the hidden back exit to spare them any embarrassment. They dragged the two bleeding, sobbing criminals right through the very center of the grand ballroom. They were paraded past the hundreds of flashing smartphone cameras, past the disgusted stares of their former elite colleagues, and past the massive digital banner celebrating their stolen achievements. Their wailing cries faded slowly as they were pushed out the heavy brass front doors and shoved into the back of waiting federal transport vehicles. The trap was finally completely empty, and the long, terrifying hunt of the bloodhound was officially over. The sun rose over Atlanta on Saturday morning, casting a warm, golden light through the kitchen windows of my quiet suburban home. It was the first time in 2 years that the air inside my house felt completely clean. The toxic, heavy shadow that Savannah had cast over our family was entirely gone. I stood at the kitchen counter wearing my comfortable old cardigan and poured myself a hot cup of black coffee. The dark roast smelled rich and grounding. Upstairs, my son Terrence was finally sleeping peacefully in his childhood bedroom. He had collapsed into bed late last night, completely exhausted after the massive emotional adrenaline of the federal raid wore off. He was finally safe. His brilliant medical patent was safe. And the woman who had actively tried to destroy his life and lock his elderly father in a mental asylum was currently waking up on a thin mattress inside a cold, concrete federal holding cell. I took a slow, deep sip of my coffee, letting the quiet victory wash over my tired bones. The house was perfectly silent, but that silence was soon broken by the sharp ringing of the old landline phone resting on the kitchen wall. I walked over and looked at the caller identification screen. It displayed a generic automated number originating from the Fulton County Detention Center. I let it ring twice before I slowly picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear. An automated voice informed me that I had a collect call from an inmate. I pressed the button to accept the charges. Savannah sobbed, her voice echoing through the phone line, sounding completely weak and incredibly pathetic. She was crying so hard she could barely form a coherent sentence. The arrogant, vicious corporate predator who had slapped my face in the service corridor just 12 hours ago was entirely gone. She had spent the entire night locked in a tiny steel cage, surrounded by the harsh, unforgiving reality of the federal justice system. She had finally realized that her wealthy lover, Preston Sinclair, was not going to send an expensive team of lawyers to rescue her. Preston was currently fighting his own massive federal money laundering charges, and he had already thrown her completely under the bus to save himself. Savannah was entirely alone, and in her absolute desperation, she called the very man she had tried to destroy. "Warren, please, you have to help me." Savannah wailed, her voice cracking with raw panic. "It is so cold in here. The guards treat me like absolute garbage. They took my clothes and my jewelry. You have to call the bank and post my bail, Warren. I know you have the money. I saw the federal documents last night. You are incredibly rich. Please, I am your family. I am Terrence's wife. You cannot just leave me in this horrible place." I stood in my warm kitchen looking out at the beautiful green lawn Ivonne had planted years ago. I listened to her desperate, pathetic begging, and I felt absolutely zero pity. I took another slow sip of my hot coffee. "Do you remember the old industrial warehouse on the edge of the city, Savannah?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any emotion. "The dilapidated brick building you and Preston planned to illegally seize and sell for quick cash after you threw me into the psychiatric ward." She stopped crying for a brief second, confused by my question. "Yes," she hiccuped weakly. "I used that exact same warehouse to completely finance the recovery of my son's stolen life work," I explained smoothly, delivering the final devastating blow to her greedy heart. "I leveraged the commercial property value of that building through the Ivonne Trust, and I legally purchased the entire Vanguard Tech Ventures medical portfolio during the federal asset freeze early this morning. The medical device you worked so incredibly hard to steal is now fully registered under a secure corporate entity owned entirely by Terrence. He is the sole supreme executive of his own brilliant creation." "No." Savannah gasped, a fresh wave of absolute terror washing over her. "You have absolutely nothing left, Savannah," I told her, my voice dropping into a cold, lethal register. "You do not have a company. You do not have a husband. You do not have a single penny of the money you violently stole from my boy. And you certainly do not have a family to bail you out of federal prison. Enjoy your new concrete home." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the button, completely disconnecting the line. I cut off her agonizing screams and placed the receiver gently back on the wall mount. I did not even have time to finish my cup of coffee before the absolute final piece of the battlefield presented itself right on my front lawn. The loud, aggressive screech of heavy car tires echoed down my quiet suburban street. A massive, pristine white luxury sport utility vehicle swerved sharply and parked illegally right across my driveway, blocking the path. The heavy doors flew open, and two people marched furiously up my front walkway. It was Thomas and Martha Vance, Savannah's biological parents. They were the exact arrogant, wealthy people who had taught their daughter how to look down on the rest of the world. They were an older white couple who wore expensive country club attire and carried an unbearable sense of racial and financial superiority everywhere they went. For 5 years, they had refused to invite me or Ivonne to their lavish holiday parties. They made passive-aggressive racist comments about my neighborhood, and they treated my brilliant son like he was a hired servant who had somehow tricked their perfect blonde daughter into marriage. I unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the wooden porch before they could even ring the bell. I stood at the top of the stairs looking down at them. Thomas Vance was red in the face, breathing heavily, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. Martha stood right behind him, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "Where is my daughter, you crazy old fool?" Thomas roared, his loud, aggressive voice shattering the peaceful Saturday morning. "We got a call from the police department saying Savannah was arrested at a corporate gala last night. We know exactly what you did, Warren. We know you set her up. You and your pathetic son planted fake evidence to steal her company. You are going to pay for this." Martha shrieked, her face twisted with pure aristocratic hatred. "We have the best defense attorneys in Atlanta on speed dial. We are going to sue you for everything you own. We will have you thrown in a federal prison for false imprisonment and malicious prosecution. You people are all exactly the same. You are just jealous criminals trying to ruin successful families." I did not raise my voice. I did not step back. I just looked at the two arrogant racists standing on my lawn, completely blinded by their own toxic entitlement. They thought they could simply march onto my property and bully an elderly black man into submission with loud threats and expensive lawyers. I reached into the large pocket of my comfortable wool cardigan. I pulled out a thin black leather folder. I had anticipated their arrival, and the bloodhound always prepares for every single variable. I opened the folder and pulled out 3 crisp, highlighted financial documents. I held them up in the bright morning sunlight for Thomas and Martha to see clearly. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Thomas," I said, my voice a low, steady rumble that instantly silenced his aggressive shouting. "Your daughter was incredibly successful at stealing money. But she did not just use the stolen corporate funds to buy diamond earrings and luxury hotel suites for herself." Thomas frowned, his aggressive posture faltering slightly as he looked at the official bank seals printed on the pages I was holding. "My forensic accountant spent the entire night tracking the offshore wire transfers your daughter initiated over the last 2 years, I explained coldly. "It turns out Savannah was heavily subsidizing your perfect wealthy lifestyle, using the money she violently embezzled from my son's medical startup and from Preston's fraudulent investors." Martha gasped, taking a sudden step backward as if the papers I held were highly radioactive. "That is a complete lie," she stammered defensively. "Savannah is a successful executive. She gave us legitimate financial gifts. There is absolutely no such thing as a legitimate gift when the money is stolen from a federal bank account." "Martha," I corrected her sharply, locking my eyes directly onto hers. "These documents show a direct wire transfer of $100,000 into your personal account, which you immediately used to purchase that brand new luxury boat docked at your private lake house. Another transfer of $50,000 paid for your exclusive country club membership fees. You have been living like absolute royalty on money your daughter stole from a black man." The profound, absolute horror finally washed over their privileged, arrogant faces. The blood drained from Thomas Vance's cheeks, leaving him looking like a sick old ghost. They realized they were not just the angry parents of a wrongly accused daughter. They were the direct beneficiaries of a massive federal money laundering conspiracy. Under federal law, the government has the absolute right to seize any and all assets purchased with embezzled funds. I told them, outlining their total doom with cold, ruthless precision. "The federal agents are already compiling the warrants. If you do not turn around, get in your car, and leave my property right this second, I will make one phone call to the federal task force commander. I will hand over these specific wire transfers, and I will have both of you formally indicted as active accomplices for knowingly receiving and harboring stolen federal assets. You will lose your boat, your country club, and your massive house. You will spend your golden years sitting in a cold federal penitentiary cell right next to your precious daughter." The silence that fell over my front lawn was absolute and incredibly beautiful. Thomas and Martha Vance did not scream anymore. They did not threaten to sue me or call me names. The loud, arrogant bullies had been completely and utterly silenced by the crushing, terrifying weight of their own criminal complicity. Thomas slowly turned around. He grabbed his trembling wife's arm and guided her back toward their massive luxury vehicle. They moved like broken, fragile people completely stripped of their false superiority. They climbed into their expensive car and sped away down the street, running desperately back to a home they were destined to lose. The battlefield was completely cleared. The poisonous roots had been entirely ripped out of the ground. The months that followed the spectacular collapse of Vanguard Tech Ventures moved with a quiet, healing rhythm. The The federal justice system is a massive, slow-moving machine, but when it finally locks onto a target, it crushes them completely. I sat in the back row of the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta watching the final sentencing of the two arrogant predators who tried to destroy my family. The courtroom was cold and filled with the heavy, silent weight of absolute consequence. Preston Sinclair, the wealthy tech billionaire who refused to do honest business with black entrepreneurs, was completely stripped of his custom velvet suits and his unearned privilege. He stood before the federal judge wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his hands bound in heavy iron chains that clinked loudly in the quiet room. He begged the judge for leniency, sobbing about his ruined reputation, but the judge showed absolutely zero mercy. She looked down from her high bench and sentenced him to 12 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for massive corporate money laundering, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy. He wept openly, a broken, pathetic man, as the armed bailiffs dragged him away. Savannah stood next. The beautiful, manipulative socialite who thought she could gaslight my son and throw me into a locked mental asylum looked incredibly pale and entirely broken. Her blonde hair was a tangled, messy knot, and the arrogant fire in her blue eyes had been completely extinguished. The federal judge looked down at her with profound, unyielding disgust. For the crimes of aggravated identity theft, corporate espionage, and the malicious conspiracy to permanently deprive an elderly citizen of his freedom, Savannah was sentenced to 10 long years in a federal prison. She did not even look back at us as they led her out of the courtroom. The toxic parasites were finally and permanently removed from our world. While the criminals rotted in their cold concrete cells, my son Terrence experienced a spectacular and beautiful rebirth. He did not let the trauma of his disastrous marriage break his brilliant spirit. With the massive financial backing of the Ivonne Trust and the full legal control of his own medical patent, Terrence built a brand new medical technology company from the absolute ground up. He moved out of that small, depressing laboratory and opened a massive state-of-the-art research facility right here in Atlanta. I watched with immense pride as he stood on his own brightly lit stage, unveiling the revolutionary medical device that would save countless lives. He was no longer the exhausted, defeated man who had cried to me on a video call. He was a confident, powerful chief executive officer, fully stepping into the massive potential his mother and I always knew he possessed. He hired a brilliant team of honest, hardworking engineers, and he made sure that absolute integrity was the foundation of his entire corporate empire. The legacy he was building was completely untouchable, and it belonged entirely to him. As for me, I did exactly what I have done for the last 25 years. I did not move into a sprawling mansion in a gated community. I did not buy a fleet of luxury imported cars or start wearing heavy gold watches. That flashy, superficial lifestyle belongs to people who desperately need to prove their worth to complete strangers. I already knew exactly who I was, and I knew exactly the kind of man my sweet Ivonne fell in love with. I stayed right here in my quiet suburban house on the south side. I put my custom-tailored charcoal pinstripe suit back into the heavy, dust-proof garment bag and pushed it to the very back of my dark closet. The bloodhound had successfully completed his final hunt, and it was time for him to go back to sleep. I put on my faded brown wool cardigan and my comfortable orthopedic walking shoes. I spent my quiet mornings drinking black coffee on the front porch, waving to my neighbor Victor as he drove past in his rusted old pickup truck. I spent my long, warm afternoons pushing my old lawnmower across the front yard, trimming the grass and carefully tending to the beautiful yellow rose bushes Ivonne had planted decades ago. The profound, deep satisfaction of honest physical labor kept me grounded. It reminded me that true power is not about dominating other people or hoarding massive wealth. True power is the absolute freedom to simply exist in perfect, quiet peace without constantly looking over your shoulder. It was a late Sunday afternoon when the sleek black luxury sedan pulled into my driveway. The warm Georgia sun was just beginning to set, casting a long, beautiful golden glow across the freshly cut grass. Terrence stepped out of his car wearing a comfortable polo shirt and a relaxed, familiar smile. He walked up the wooden steps of the front porch carrying a paper bag filled with fresh peach cobbler from the local bakery. I was sitting in my favorite wooden rocking chair, listening to the gentle hum of the summer crickets and the distant happy sound of neighborhood children playing in the street. Terrence handed me the warm bag and sat down heavily in the empty rocking chair right next to me. We sat there in a comfortable, familiar silence for a very long time, just watching the evening sky slowly change from bright orange to a deep, peaceful purple. I looked over at my son. He was staring out at the quiet street, but his dark eyes were shining with heavy, unshed tears. The massive emotional weight of the past year, the betrayal, the federal raid, the trial, and the glorious rebuilding of his life was finally catching up to him in the profound safety of our shared silence. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and buried his face deep in his hands. Dad Terrence whispered, his voice cracking with a deep, profound sorrow that broke my heart. I am so incredibly sorry. I am so sorry I ever doubted you. I am so sorry I let that monster into our home, and I am so sorry I almost let her lock you away. I was completely blind, and I almost lost you forever because I was entirely too stupid to see the absolute truth standing right in front of me. He began to weep quietly, the heavy, honest tears of a good man releasing a massive burden of lingering guilt. I did not interrupt him. I let him cry because I knew he desperately needed to completely empty his soul of that toxic poison. When his tears finally began to slow down, I reached out my calloused, weathered hand. I placed it firmly on his broad shoulder, offering him the warm, steady, unwavering strength of a father who had never once stopped loving him. I looked at my boy, and I gave him a soft, gentle smile. "You do not ever need to apologize to me, Terrence," I told him, my voice a low, comforting rumble in the quiet evening air. "You were navigating a terrible, dark storm, and that woman was actively blinding you to the dangerous rocks. But you survived it. We survived it, and we absolutely did not do it alone." I looked up at the darkening Atlanta sky, thinking about the brilliant, beautiful woman who had spent her final dying days mapping out an entire criminal conspiracy in a cold industrial warehouse just to keep her family safe. "Your mother protected us, Terrence," I said softly, feeling a deep, warm, comforting presence settling over the old wooden porch. "She saw the deadly danger long before either of us did, and she gave me the exact tools I needed to completely dismantle their trap. She loved you more than life itself, and she made absolutely sure that nobody would ever steal your future. Do not carry this heavy guilt anymore, my son. The dark storm is completely over. Your mother protected us, and we are safe now." It was a bright, warm Sunday morning when I drove my rusted pickup truck back to the quiet cemetery on the outskirts of Atlanta. The sky above was a brilliant, crystal-clear blue, completely different from the dark, freezing rain that had soaked my clothes on the day we put my sweet Ivonne into the ground. The air smelled of fresh pine needles and warm earth. The heavy, dark storm that had violently threatened to consume my family was completely gone, leaving behind a profound, unbroken peace. I parked my truck near the iron gates and walked slowly across the freshly cut green grass, holding a single pristine white rose in my calloused hand. I reached her headstone and stood there for a long time, just listening to the gentle rustling of the leaves in the ancient oak trees above. I slowly knelt down. My knees popped a little, reminding me of my 73 years on this earth. But the pain was entirely manageable. I placed the beautiful white rose gently against the cool gray stone right beneath her perfectly engraved name. "I did it, Ivonne." I whispered, my voice thick with emotion but completely steady. "I did exactly what you asked me to do. I found your hidden warehouse. I saw the massive, incredible war room you built while you were so incredibly sick. I took the undeniable evidence you gathered, and I used it to absolutely destroy the monsters who were trying to ruin our boy. Terrence is completely safe now, my love. He has his medical patent back. He opened his own massive research facility, and he is thriving. Savannah is sitting in a federal prison cell, and she will not see the outside world for 10 long years. You protected us, Ivonne. Even when you were dying, you were the fiercest protector this family ever had. I am so incredibly proud of you, and I miss you every single day." I rested my hand on the warm granite of her headstone, feeling a deep, spiritual connection to the brilliant woman who had shared my life for 45 years. She was a high school teacher who loved baking peach cobbler, but underneath that gentle exterior she possessed the strategic mind of a master chess player. She knew exactly how the world worked, and she knew exactly how society viewed people like us. Society has a very specific and incredibly cruel way of looking at a man like me. When you are an older African-American man walking through a wealthy suburban neighborhood, or standing in the pristine marble lobby of a high-rise corporate bank, people do not see a lifetime of achievement. They do not see a brilliant mind or a senior federal forensic auditor who used to take down global money laundering syndicates for the United States government. They look at my faded brown wool cardigan, my scuffed orthopedic shoes, and the deep, heavy wrinkles lining my dark skin, and they immediately write me off as completely insignificant. They look at the color of my skin and my humble demeanor, and they instantly decide that I am uneducated, helpless, and entirely disposable. They see a fragile, retired postal worker who probably needs help crossing a busy street. Savannah and her wealthy, arrogant lover, Preston Sinclair, built their entire criminal strategy on that exact racist, ageist assumption. They thought my quiet demeanor was a symptom of a rotting, senile brain. They thought my endless patience was a clear sign of absolute weakness. They thought they could easily forge documents, steal my son's legacy, and throw me into a miserable, locked psychiatric ward because they truly believed a black man in his 70s had absolutely zero power to fight back against their wealthy white privilege. They never once stopped to consider that the old man sitting silently in the faded armchair staring blankly at the wall was actually taking meticulous mental notes. They never realized that while they were loudly insulting me in my own living room, I was actively mapping out the complete destruction of their entire corporate empire. They confused my strategic silence with total surrender. That was their absolute fatal mistake. The invisibility of being an old black man in America is a heavy burden to carry, but if you know how to use it, that invisibility becomes your absolute greatest weapon. I let them believe their own arrogant lies. I let them think they were the apex predators hunting a weak, helpless animal. I put on the disguise of the confused, retired mailman, and I walked right past their security desks into their private offices and deep into their encrypted bank accounts without anyone ever noticing my presence. True justice is never born from loud, explosive anger. Savannah operated on pure, toxic emotion. She threw theatrical tantrums, she smashed doors with heavy hammers, and she screamed violently in hotel hallways when she finally lost control. But loud anger is incredibly sloppy. It blinds you to your own mistakes, and it leaves massive holes in your defense. I learned decades ago in the high-stakes halls of the federal government that the absolute greatest revenge is a meticulously prepared truth. You do not need to yell or scream when you have the undeniable facts resting quietly in your inner pocket. You do not need to throw a physical punch when you can completely freeze a billionaire's bank account with a single phone call. You simply let the arrogant predators build their own elaborate traps, you let them step inside, and then you quietly lock the heavy steel door right behind them. I stood up from the grave, brushing the loose blades of green grass from the knees of my trousers. I looked down at the white rose resting peacefully against the gray stone. The bloodhound had successfully completed his final hunt. The federal executioner was officially retired and safely buried deep underground. I was just Warren again. A proud father, a devoted widower, and a man who simply wanted to spend his remaining years tending to his garden and watching his brilliant son change the world. I turned away from the headstone and walked slowly back across the quiet cemetery toward my rusted old pickup truck. I opened the heavy metal door, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The old motor rumbled to life, a steady, comforting sound. I drove out of the iron gates and headed back toward my quiet home on the south side of Atlanta. I rolled down the window, letting the warm Georgia breeze wash over my face. For the first time in 2 long years, I had absolutely nothing to hide and absolutely nothing to fight. The profound, unbreakable peace had finally returned, and it belonged entirely to me. True power does not scream for attention. It waits in the absolute silence of observation. When you judge a person by the wrinkles on their face, the color of their skin, or the simplicity of their clothes, you risk underestimating the brilliant mind hidden beneath. My daughter-in-law mistook my quiet demeanor for senility and my patience for weakness. She let arrogance blind her, forgetting that the most lethal chess players never reveal their moves until checkmate is inevitable. Character is not measured by the luxury you wear, but by the integrity you uphold. In the end, those who build their empires on deceit will inevitably be crushed by the heavy, silent weight of the truth. Never mistake an old man's silence for surrender. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful life lessons. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to teach an arrogant person a harsh lesson about respect? Thank you for listening, and always remember, true strength whispers, it never shouts.